Who were the Huns? How did a nomadic people with no cities, no written language, and no permanent state come to shake the foundations of the Roman world? And why, after rising to such prominence, did they vanish almost as quickly as they appeared? In the late 4th and early 5th centuries, a new force arrived on the borders of Europe, swift, elusive, and terrifying to those who faced them. The Huns did not conquer with the slow march of armies and siege engines. They came from the steppes with speed, precision, and shock. To the Romans, they seemed like an unstoppable wave from the east, driving entire peoples before them and rewriting the balance of power in Europe. This is not just the story of Attila, although he will play a central role. It is the story of a people who rose from obscurity in Central Asia to become one of the most feared names in European history. This is the entire story of the Huns. Let us begin. Long before the name Hun would strike fear into the heart of the Roman Empire, they were a people without a name in European records, moving across the vast open grasslands of Central Asia. Their arrival on the western edge of the Eurasian steppe would become one of the most transformative migrations of late antiquity. But to understand their sudden appearance in the historical record, we must first look to the east. The earliest possible roots of the Huns may lie among the nomadic cultures of Inner Asia, an enormous region stretching from modern-day Mongolia across Kazakhstan and toward the Caspian Sea. These lands were home to a succession of horse-riding peoples who mastered the art of mobile warfare and survived through a combination of herding, raiding, and trade. Among these ancient nomads, the most powerful and organized group during the early centuries before the Common Era were the Xiongnu. They emerged in Chinese records during the 3rd century before the Common Era and posed a serious threat to the Han dynasty in northern China. For centuries, the Chinese and the Xiongnu fought a series of border wars, alliances, and standoffs. The Great Wall, which had begun as a set of scattered fortifications, was expanded and fortified in part to resist these raids. The Xiongnu practiced a style of steppe warfare that would become familiar in later centuries. Highly mobile archers on horseback, striking quickly and disappearing before infantry-based armies could respond. Their political system was based around powerful clan leaders and a ruling Khan who held alliances together through prestige and force. These patterns, nomadic warfare, clan-based politics, and the use of pressure on settled empires, would reappear in later steppe empires, including the Huns. By the 1st century of the Common Era, however, the power of the Xiongnu had begun to decline. Internal divisions and sustained pressure from Chinese forces forced parts of the Xiongnu Confederation to migrate westward. Some splinter groups vanished into the Central Asian interior, absorbed by other nomadic cultures. Others possibly moved into the western steppe, the region north of the Black Sea, though the evidence is sparse and uncertain. It is here that the historical trail runs cold. No sources from the Huns themselves survive. They left no writings, no inscriptions, no monuments. Everything we know about them comes from outsiders: Greek, Roman, Persian, Chinese, and later Arab chroniclers. The earliest unambiguous references to the Huns appear only in the late 4th century of the Common Era, when they suddenly erupt into the affairs of the Roman Empire. Between the 1st and 4th centuries, something changed. A group of people with many features resembling earlier Inner Asian nomads began to move steadily westward. They did not leave records, but the archaeological evidence provides some clues. Burials and artifacts found in Kazakhstan, the Urals, and the Pontic steppe show signs of continuity with earlier steppe cultures, but also new traits, especially in weapons and horse gear. These suggest a blending of traditions, perhaps as different nomadic groups intermingled or were displaced by stronger rivals. One theory suggests that the Huns were driven westward by conflicts deeper in Asia, possibly by the expansion of other rising powers, such as the Ruran or the early Turkic confederations. As one group pressed west, it displaced another, creating a chain of movement across the steppes. This domino effect, where the movement of one people sets off others, was a common feature of steppe geopolitics. By the mid-4th century of the Common Era, the Huns reached the Volga River. This would mark the eastern edge of Europe, and the first moment when Roman writers began to take notice. Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian writing in the late 4th century, described the Huns as a people savage beyond compare, living without towns or permanent homes, eating raw meat and barely speaking an intelligible language. He claimed they were born in the saddle and that their entire lives were spent on horseback. While these accounts are laced with exaggeration and cultural bias, they reflect the shock of the Roman world encountering a completely alien military and cultural system. The Huns' appearance along the Volga coincided with the disintegration of another powerful steppe confederation, the Alans. The Alans, an Iranian-speaking nomadic people, had long dominated the region between the Caspian and the Don rivers. But as the Huns arrived, the Alans were defeated in a series of brutal confrontations. Some were killed, others submitted, and still others fled westward. It was at this point that the Huns began to absorb not just land, but also people. The defeated Alans were incorporated into the Hunnic war machine. This would become a defining trait of Hunnic expansion, their ability to absorb subject peoples and integrate them into their military and administrative systems. This allowed them to grow rapidly without having to rely solely on their own population. By the year 370, the Huns had reached the Don River and clashed with the Ostrogoths, another powerful tribal federation. Under their king Ermanaric, the Ostrogoths ruled a vast territory stretching from the Don to the Dniester. But when the Huns appeared, their fast-moving cavalry overwhelmed the Gothic defenses. Ermanaric, according to some sources, took his own life in despair. His kingdom fell apart, and many of his people fled westward. This event triggered a massive population shift. The Visigoths, cousins of the Ostrogoths, now also faced pressure from the east. In desperation, they petitioned the Eastern Roman Empire for refuge and were allowed to cross the Danube River in the year 376. This decision would have far-reaching consequences for the Romans. Within 2 years, the displaced Goths would rebel and win a stunning victory over the Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople, where Emperor Valens was killed. Although the Huns did not participate directly in that battle, it was their pressure that set it all in motion. By destabilizing the steppe and pushing peoples into Roman territory, the Huns had unknowingly become one of the major catalysts of late Roman history. But in these early years, the Huns themselves remained elusive. They did not build cities or record treaties. Their leaders are unnamed in these initial stages. Instead, they moved through the landscape like a force of nature, appearing suddenly, striking quickly, and then vanishing. To the settled peoples of Europe, they seemed more like a myth than a nation. However, this was beginning to change. As they continued to move westward, the Huns began to encounter not just scattered tribes, but the organized structures of the Roman Empire itself. They would shift from a mobile raiding force to a formidable political and military power. Their leadership would consolidate, their ambitions would grow, and their impact would no longer be indirect. As the Huns advanced westward from the steppes beyond the Volga River, their arrival ignited a movement of peoples that would permanently reshape the political and demographic map of Europe. Their rapid mobility, aggressive tactics, and unfamiliar warfare created a ripple effect. One tribe after another was displaced, forced to flee or defend, each pushing the next in a great domino chain of migrations. This period, stretching roughly from the middle of the 4th century to the beginning of the 5th, was the beginning of what historians now call the migration period, or Völkerwanderung in German. It marked the end of Roman stability in Europe and the birth of a new, unsettled world. The first major impact of the Huns' westward movement was the disintegration of the Gothic kingdoms in the regions between the Don and Dniester rivers. The Ostrogoths, previously dominant in this area, were the first to fall. After their defeat, the surviving fragments of their population either submitted to the Huns or fled toward the west. But it was the Visigoths, occupying lands closer to the Roman border, who found themselves directly caught in the wave of pressure. The Visigoths, led by a king named Fritigern, faced a choice: face the approaching Huns, or seek refuge within the Roman Empire. In the year 376, they made a historic request to cross the Danube River and enter Roman territory. Emperor Valens, ruling the Eastern Roman Empire from Constantinople, granted them temporary asylum on the condition that they disarm and settle under Roman oversight. The Romans saw them as potential agricultural laborers and auxiliary soldiers. But this plan collapsed almost immediately. Corrupt Roman officials exploited the refugees, selling them dog meat at inflated prices and allowing their families to starve. Tensions rose quickly, and soon the Visigoths erupted in open revolt. 2 years later, in the year 378, the Roman army met the Visigoths in battle near the city of Adrianople. The result was a disaster for Rome. Emperor Valens was killed and 2/3 of the Roman army was destroyed. It was one of the worst defeats Rome had ever suffered. And although the Huns were not on that battlefield, their indirect role was undeniable. The shock of Adrianople was not just military, but psychological. The Eastern Empire had allowed a foreign people to cross its frontier, and that people had destroyed a Roman field army. This pattern of displacement and conflict would repeat across the Roman frontier. Following the Gothic migration, other tribes found themselves under pressure from the advancing Huns. The Alans, a once powerful nomadic people, had already been weakened by Hunnic assaults east of the Don River. Many of them began to migrate westward in fragmented groups, seeking alliances with Germanic tribes or opportunities within the Roman sphere. One significant development occurred as the Vandals, a Germanic group, began to migrate under pressure from both the Huns and surrounding rivals. By the end of the 4th century, the Vandals, together with the Alans and the Suebi, moved en masse across the Rhine River in the year 406. This invasion breached the Western Roman Empire's frontier and marked the beginning of major tribal settlements within Roman Gaul and Hispania. These groups would eventually form their own kingdoms within the former Roman provinces, such as the Vandal Kingdom in North Africa and the Suebi in northwestern Iberia. It is important to understand that the Huns themselves did not directly orchestrate these movements. Rather, they were the unseen force pushing from behind, an unrelenting presence that destabilized the steppe and forced other peoples to find safety wherever they could. Their presence shifted the balance of power and created a chain reaction that the Romans could not stop. While these migrations were happening, the Huns themselves were consolidating power in the lands just beyond the Danube. They began to form more organized raiding parties and exerted control over the fragmented groups they had displaced or absorbed. Among these were elements of the Alans, Ostrogoths, and other steppe peoples. This mixture of ethnicities under Hunnic dominance would later evolve into a multi-tribal military machine, bound not by ethnic loyalty, but by allegiance to strong war leaders and shared interests in plunder and prestige. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was reeling. It faced multiple challenges at once: internal power struggles, a failing economy, declining military strength, and waves of external migration and invasion. The role of the Huns was not always visible, but it was fundamental. Without their initial pressure on the Gothic world, the entire cascade of events leading to the Gothic War, the sack of Rome in the year 410, and the loss of the western provinces might have unfolded very differently. One Roman observer, the Christian theologian Jerome, wrote in despair during this time, "The whole world is collapsing, the Roman world is falling, and we are still asleep." His words captured the growing anxiety among educated Romans, who could see their empire no longer held the strength it once had. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire tried to manage this growing instability through diplomacy and payments. The emperors in Constantinople offered tribute to various migrating tribes in exchange for peace, but this was a temporary solution. The empire's borders had become porous, and its resources were increasingly strained. The Western Empire, far weaker, lacked both the administrative capacity and military might to respond effectively. In this chaotic environment, a new generation of Roman generals arose, men like Flavius Stilicho in the west and Flavius Aetius a few decades later. These commanders, often of mixed Roman and barbarian backgrounds, understood the necessity of managing tribal politics and negotiating with emerging powers. They hired Hunnic mercenaries to fight against other tribes, offered land to some groups, and fought brutal campaigns to contain others. But their efforts were reactive rather than strategic. The Huns had not yet become a formal empire, but their influence was growing. The internal politics of Rome itself did little to help the situation. In both the eastern and western courts, court intrigue and political instability weakened the ability of emperors to respond coherently. While the East managed to stabilize under Theodosius II, the Western court in Ravenna often operated in confusion, relying heavily on generals and regents to maintain control. As these pressures mounted, the Huns themselves began to develop beyond scattered warbands. By the early 5th century, leaders like Uldan and later Ruga began to appear in Roman sources. They represented a new stage in Hunnic organization, a shift from raiding to diplomacy, negotiation, and tribute extraction. The Huns were not simply wandering marauders, they were learning to leverage their military power for political gain. Throughout this period, the Huns maintained their power through two key advantages. First, they had exceptional mobility. Their horse archers could move faster than Roman legions and strike without warning. Second, they relied on psychological warfare, using terror as a deliberate tool to paralyze opposition. Stories of their cruelty, whether exaggerated or not, served a purpose. When a city heard the Huns were approaching, resistance often collapsed before a single arrow was fired. This transformation, from mysterious steppe raiders into a recognized regional power, set the stage for their eventual confrontation with the Roman world. But at this stage, they were still a shadow on the edge of the empire, powerful, feared, but not yet unified under a single ruler. The world they had helped create was now one of permanent instability. Entire peoples were on the move. Rome was no longer in control of its borders. The barbarian kingdoms were rising in Gaul, Iberia, and North Africa. And through it all, the Huns continued to grow in strength, absorbing new warriors, refining their strategy, and watching for opportunity. By the final decades of the 4th century, the shock waves set off by the Huns had already altered the balance of power in Europe. They had shattered tribal kingdoms across the steppe and triggered migrations that rippled deep into the Roman Empire. But until this point, the Huns themselves remained largely in the background, seen only through the consequences of their pressure. That was about to change. In the final years of the 370s and into the early 400s, the Huns stepped into the Roman world directly, not just as a distant force of chaos, but as visible actors in military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and the shifting politics of empire. The earliest detailed Roman account of the Huns comes from Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian and former soldier. Writing near the end of the 4th century, he described them as inhuman and terrifying, claiming they resembled wild beasts more than men. Their speech, he wrote, was barely comprehensible. Their lifestyle, he insisted, was entirely nomadic, with no cities, no temples, and no agriculture. Ammianus had never met the Huns himself. His account was shaped by second-hand reports and the anxiety of the times. But the portrayal stuck. From this point forward, Roman writers would describe the Huns through a lens of fear, otherness, and cultural distance. What had once been a distant threat now became a direct reality for the Roman provinces along the Danube frontier. By the year 395, the Huns launched raids deep into Roman territory, striking across the Danube and into the Balkans. These were not exploratory forays. They were coordinated, aggressive invasions designed to test Roman defenses and extract tribute. Cities and towns along the frontier were sacked. Fortified settlements were bypassed or overcome. The Roman military, stretched thin and reorganizing after decades of internal strife, was often too slow to respond. These early incursions also revealed something important about the Huns. They were not interested in holding territory. They did not settle, govern, or establish administrative centers. Their goal was wealth, gold, livestock, captives, and prestige. Once they had taken what they wanted, they withdrew as quickly as they had arrived. This mobility made them difficult to confront. Even when Roman generals managed to gather an army, the Huns were often already gone. During these early years of contact, the Roman Empire found itself facing a new strategic dilemma. The old model of frontier defense, walls, watchtowers, legions stationed along rivers, was not designed to deal with fast-moving horse archers who could appear and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Moreover, the Huns did not fight like traditional enemies. They avoided direct confrontation when possible. Instead, they harassed, surrounded, and demoralized. Their composite bows, used with great skill from horseback, allowed them to dominate open terrain. In response, Roman officials began to seek alternatives to direct military confrontation. One of these was diplomacy. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, began to negotiate with Hunnic leaders. These negotiations often centered around tribute payments, gold offered in exchange for peace. From the Roman perspective, this was a practical solution. The empire was rich in resources, but lacked the manpower for sustained border wars. Paying off the Huns allowed Constantinople to focus its efforts elsewhere. But to the Huns, tribute was not merely payment, it was recognition. In their cultural framework, accepting gold from an enemy was not submission, it was a sign of superiority. The Roman mistake was to view these arrangements as bribes. The Huns, by contrast, viewed them as contracts between equals, agreements that granted them legitimacy and status. This misunderstanding would lead to future conflict, especially when Rome delayed or reduced payments. Meanwhile, Hunnic groups began to appear in the Roman world in another role, as mercenaries. Roman generals, desperate for manpower, began recruiting Huns into their armies. These Huns fought in Roman campaigns not only along the frontiers, but even in internal civil wars. One notable example is the Roman general Flavius Stilicho, a powerful figure in the Western Roman Empire, who used Hunnic cavalry to suppress revolts and defend Italy against Gothic incursions. These mercenaries proved highly effective, and their use became more widespread in the early 5th century. This dual role, simultaneously as enemies and allies, defined the complex relationship between the Huns and Rome during this period. On the one hand, they were raiders and extortionists, threatening Roman stability. On the other, they were indispensable soldiers in Roman service, used against other barbarians and internal foes. This contradiction was not sustainable. Eventually, the Huns would no longer be content with temporary alliances and payments. They would seek something greater: political power, strategic influence, and permanent recognition. As Hunnic power grew, so did their internal organization. By the early 5th century, Roman sources begin to name specific Hunnic leaders, suggesting that the scattered war bands of the past were coalescing under more stable leadership. One of these figures was Uldan, a Hunnic warlord who operated along the lower Danube and came into direct conflict with the Eastern Roman Empire. In the year 408, Uldan led a series of raids into Roman territory, but was eventually defeated near the city of Castra Martis. His defeat, however, did not represent a collapse in Hunnic power. Rather, it was a sign that their incursions were becoming more systematic and ambitious. Another major step in Hunnic involvement in Roman affairs occurred during the Western Empire's internal power struggles. In the year 425, Flavius Aetius, a Roman general and political figure, enlisted the support of Hunnic forces to help him secure control of the imperial court in Ravenna. The Huns responded by sending cavalry to support Aetius, who successfully used their help to gain influence in the Western Roman Empire. This alliance would become a recurring pattern throughout Aetius's career, and it reveals just how deeply embedded the Huns were becoming in the politics of the empire. From this point onward, the Huns were not merely raiders, they were a geopolitical force. They could tip the balance in Roman civil wars, determine the fate of provinces, and negotiate as equals with emperors. Their leaders learned how to use diplomacy and warfare in tandem. They studied Roman politics and played rival factions against one another. And increasingly, they began to see the empire not as an adversary to be destroyed, but as a system to be manipulated. This stage of development also saw a growing integration of non-Hunnic peoples into their military structure. The Huns absorbed not only defeated tribes, but also volunteers and opportunists who saw benefit in joining their ranks. Many of these newcomers brought with them valuable skills, craftsmanship, weapon production, and knowledge of Roman fortifications. The Huns, who had once relied solely on speed and surprise, began to evolve. By the early 430s, it became clear that the balance of power was shifting. The Huns were no longer a border problem. They were becoming a central player in the destiny of both Eastern and Western Roman empires. The tribute payments increased. The scale of raids expanded. Roman cities along the Danube were now paying directly for protection. The empire was buying time. By the late 4th century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire was no longer facing a world of stable frontiers. What had once been a system of controlled borders and managed diplomacy was rapidly becoming a landscape defined by unpredictability, movement, and fear. Central to this transformation was the displacement of the Goths, a large and militarily capable group whose fate would bring the Huns and the Roman world into sharp collision. The Visigoths, a branch of the broader Gothic people, had settled for decades along the northern edge of the Danube River. They were semi-sedentary, practiced agriculture, and maintained an uneasy relationship with the Eastern Roman Empire. But their society was vulnerable to the pressure building on the steppe behind them. As Hunnic forces pushed westward, defeating and absorbing peoples in their path, the Visigoths found themselves with few options. The death of the Ostrogothic king Ermanaric, likely in the face of overwhelming Hunnic pressure, sent shockwaves through the Gothic world. The Ostrogoths, who had dominated the lands further east, collapsed as a political entity. Many of their warriors and leaders either died or were absorbed into Hunnic service. The Visigoths, next in line, feared a similar fate. Their king at the time, Fritigern, made a calculated decision. Rather than attempt to resist both the Huns and other displaced groups now crowding their territory, he sought refuge within the Roman Empire. In the year 376, Fritigern and his people approached the Danube frontier and requested permission from the Eastern Roman authorities to cross into imperial territory. The appeal was both desperate and diplomatic. The Visigoths offered loyalty, military service, and peace in exchange for safe settlement inside the empire. Emperor Valens, who ruled the Eastern Roman Empire from Constantinople, granted their request. He was campaigning in the east at the time and likely saw the arrangement as a practical solution to multiple problems, keeping the Goths close, maintaining peace along the Danube, and potentially gaining recruits for the army. However, the execution of this policy was deeply flawed. The Roman officials tasked with managing the crossing and settlement, primarily the generals Lupicinus and Maximus, failed to provide adequate supplies or structure. The Visigoths were left in temporary camps without enough food or resources. Corruption added to the crisis. Roman officers reportedly sold spoiled dog meat to starving Gothic families in exchange for their children, who were taken as slaves. The combination of hunger, humiliation, and betrayal was combustible. Fritigern, initially cooperative, now led his people into rebellion. The Visigoths began to move through Roman Thrace, pillaging towns and recruiting followers from other oppressed groups. Attempts by Roman forces to contain them failed, largely due to poor coordination and underestimation of the Gothic military capacity. Emperor Valens, eager to restore order and perhaps win a decisive victory on his own without waiting for reinforcements from the Western Empire, decided to confront the Goths directly. In the summer of the year 378, he marched his army out from Constantinople and encountered the Gothic forces near the city of Adrianople. The Roman army on that day was composed of infantry legions, cavalry units, and auxiliary forces. It was a disciplined, professional force, though somewhat smaller than the Gothic host. The Visigoths, for their part, had a highly mobile army with a strong cavalry component, and they had spent the previous years gaining valuable combat experience. Most importantly, they were fighting for survival. On the day of the battle, the Roman forces arrived at the Gothic camp in intense summer heat. Negotiations were attempted, but mistrust on both sides made them fruitless. Valens was reportedly told that the Goths were divided or understrength, misleading intelligence that encouraged him to press for a full engagement without delay. The Battle of Adrianople was a turning point in late Roman history. As the Roman infantry formed battle lines, the Gothic cavalry, hidden or arriving late, swept into the flanks. The Roman formations collapsed under pressure. Chaos spread. Thousands of soldiers were cut down in the heat and confusion. Emperor Valens himself was either slain in battle or burned alive in a farmhouse where he had taken refuge. 2/3 of the Roman army were lost. Entire legions were annihilated. It was one of the most severe defeats the Roman Empire had ever suffered, comparable in scale and shock to the disaster at Cannae more than 5 centuries earlier. The consequences of Adrianople were immediate and far-reaching. In the short term, the Eastern Roman Empire was left militarily exposed. Gothic forces roamed freely through the Balkans, plundering towns and avoiding direct confrontation with surviving Roman units. Constantinople itself feared siege. Only the city's strong fortifications and internal Gothic divisions prevented a more devastating collapse. In the longer term, Adrianople exposed critical weaknesses in the Roman imperial system. The army was no longer capable of dealing with large, mobile enemy forces on the frontier. The political leadership underestimated the complexities of managing refugee populations. And perhaps most significantly, it became clear that the empire could not rely on military superiority alone to maintain control. The Western Roman court, under Emperor Gratian, moved cautiously. Reinforcements were eventually sent, but the political divisions between East and West delayed a coordinated response. Over the following years, the Visigoths were granted a temporary peace settlement and allowed to settle more permanently in Roman territory, though on terms far less favorable to the empire. From the perspective of the Roman elite, this was a profound humiliation. A group of foreign refugees, people who had begged for entry only a few years earlier, had now defeated a Roman emperor and extracted political concessions by force. For the Huns, it was an indirect but powerful demonstration of their influence. Their pressure had triggered the migration. Their reputation had shaped Roman responses. And their continued presence on the steppe ensured that the Gothic question remained unresolved. Adrianople also changed Roman military thinking. Future campaigns would place greater emphasis on cavalry and mobility. Roman commanders began to study the tactics used by both the Goths and the Huns. The empire increasingly relied on federated troops, barbarian allies hired or settled within Roman borders, rather than citizen legions. This shift in military structure was both necessary and dangerous, as it blurred the line between Rome and its enemies. In Roman literature and memory, the loss at Adrianople marked the beginning of a slow decline. It revealed that the empire could be hurt, even defeated, by peoples it had long considered inferior. It showed that migration could no longer be contained by fortresses and treaties. And it signaled that the Huns, though still distant, were a force that could not be ignored. As the 5th century opened, the Huns were no longer an unfamiliar threat lurking beyond the empire's eastern frontiers. Their earlier raids and indirect pressures had already reshaped the political map of the Roman world. But now, the Huns began to operate in far more complex roles, sometimes as enemies, but increasingly as allies, mercenaries, and political players inside the very system they had once threatened from without. This transition marked a new stage in Hunnic involvement with the Roman world, one that was defined not just by destruction, but by negotiation, cooperation, and manipulation. Following the Gothic crisis and the disaster at Adrianople, both halves of the Roman Empire struggled to rebuild their strength. Neither the Eastern nor the Western Roman governments had the manpower or resources to fully defend their frontiers. The result was a growing dependence on external auxiliaries, non-Roman forces, often recruited from among the very same tribal groups that had previously been enemies. In this context, the Huns offered a particularly valuable military resource. Their cavalry, speed, and archery skills were unmatched, and Roman generals quickly recognized their tactical advantages. It was not long before Hunnic troops were being recruited into Roman service. They fought alongside Roman legions in a variety of conflicts, from civil wars to frontier skirmishes. In many cases, Roman commanders would pay Hunnic chieftains directly in exchange for support, bypassing traditional recruitment systems. This relationship was transactional, not ideological. The Huns did not fight for Roman ideals or imperial loyalty. They fought for gold, plunder, and the opportunity to gain influence. One of the earliest and most significant examples of this dynamic emerged during the civil conflicts within the Western Roman Empire. In the early decades of the 5th century, the Western court at Ravenna was plagued by political instability. Rival generals, court factions, and imperial claimants vied for power. It was in this environment that Flavius Aetius, a Roman general of considerable skill, rose to prominence. Aetius had spent part of his youth as a hostage among the Huns, a common Roman diplomatic practice used to ensure the good behavior of border peoples and to cultivate relationships. During his time among the Huns, Aetius learned their language, customs, and military style. These experiences shaped his career profoundly. When he returned to Roman service, he retained strong personal connections with Hunnic leaders, connections that he would later use to his advantage. In the year 425, when Aetius found himself on the losing side of a political struggle, he turned to the Huns for support. He negotiated with them to send thousands of cavalry to aid his faction. With this force, he was able to assert control over the Western court and secure his position as the most powerful general in the Western Empire. This episode demonstrated not only Aetius's tactical brilliance, but also the Huns' new role as kingmakers in Roman internal politics. Throughout the following years, Aetius continued to employ Hunnic forces in various campaigns against internal revolts, rival barbarian tribes, and imperial challengers. This arrangement benefited both sides. The Huns received gold, tribute, and plunder. Aetius received a reliable military edge in an increasingly unstable world. But the relationship between Rome and the Huns was never simple. While some Hunnic groups served as mercenaries, others continued to raid Roman territories independently. Along the Danube frontier, Hunnic warbands would cross into Roman provinces, loot towns, take captives, and retreat before imperial forces could respond. These raids were not always acts of war. Often, they were strategic tools used to apply pressure on Roman authorities. If a payment was delayed, a treaty violated, or a negotiation failed, a raid might follow. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, faced frequent Hunnic incursions during this period. Although the Eastern court had greater financial resources than the Western half, it too relied on a delicate balance of payments, diplomacy, and occasional military confrontation to manage the Hunnic threat. Roman officials would frequently meet with Hunnic envoys to negotiate treaties, usually involving regular tribute payments in exchange for peace. These payments were substantial. In some years, gold shipped to the Huns from Constantinople amounted to a significant portion of the imperial treasury. Yet, the effectiveness of these treaties was inconsistent. Some Hunnic leaders abided by their terms. Others saw them as temporary arrangements, useful only until a better opportunity arose. The Roman practice of treating tribal groups as unified political entities often backfired. The Huns were not a single state, but a collection of shifting alliances, warbands, and chieftains. A treaty signed with one group might mean nothing to another. Roman diplomacy, grounded in the idea of centralized negotiation, struggled to manage the fluid dynamics of Hunnic leadership. Still, the Romans recognized the value of the Huns as both a threat and a tool. This was evident in the way Roman generals used Hunnic forces not only in field battles, but also in long-term garrison roles and targeted campaigns. Hunnic auxiliaries were stationed in key regions, including Gaul and the Balkans. They helped suppress revolts and fought against other barbarian groups, such as the Burgundians and the Franks. Their presence in these regions added another layer of complexity to the already unstable frontier system. The use of Hunnic mercenaries also brought cultural consequences. Roman soldiers and civilians alike came into daily contact with Hunnic warriors, witnessing their weapons, tactics, and customs. In some regions, local communities began to adapt to the realities of Hunnic presence. Tribute payments became normalized. Roman officials learned to communicate through interpreters. Military training incorporated Hunnic-style cavalry maneuvers. This cultural exchange, though often subtle, contributed to the broader process of Roman transformation in the 5th century. For the Huns themselves, this period was one of rising power and strategic flexibility. They learned the inner workings of Roman bureaucracy, military organization, and imperial politics. They observed Roman weaknesses and recognized their own strengths. The cumulative effect of this experience was significant. The Huns, once considered primitive and savage by Roman observers, had now become familiar with the very system they were learning to manipulate. At the same time, the internal structure of Hunnic society was evolving. As they gained more wealth through raiding and tribute, certain leaders began to dominate over others. Power began to concentrate in the hands of a few prominent chieftains who had both military skill and political vision. One of these men would emerge as the most significant Hunnic figure to date, Ruga. Ruga's rise was part of a broader trend toward Hunnic unification. While earlier Hunnic raids had been carried out by loosely coordinated bands, Ruga managed to assert authority over a wider confederation. He established control over various Hunnic factions and began to direct both diplomacy and warfare on a larger scale. Under his leadership, the Huns became a more centralized force, capable of negotiating as a single power and coordinating campaigns that spanned multiple regions. Ruga also deepened relationships with key Roman figures, including Flavius Aetius. Their cooperation brought mutual benefit and allowed the Huns to become more embedded in Roman politics than ever before. At the same time, Ruga maintained the Huns' independence and continued to extract tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire. He walked a careful line between ally and adversary, playing both sides when needed. By the middle of the 5th century, it was clear that the Huns were no longer simply a peripheral threat. They were central to the survival and the instability of the Roman world. As mercenaries, they bolstered imperial armies. As raiders, they destabilized provinces. As political actors, they influenced succession and power within the empire. Their relationship with Rome was pragmatic, not ideological. They did not seek to replace Roman institutions. They sought to extract wealth, gain honor, and expand their own influence. The Roman Empire, in turn, became increasingly entangled in its dependence on the Huns. Every tribute payment, every treaty, and every battlefield alliance reinforced the fact that Rome could no longer act alone. The empire had become part of a shared geopolitical space, one in which former enemies were now indispensable partners, and in which military might was no longer confined to Roman legions. By the early decades of the 5th century, the Huns had become deeply entangled in the political and military fabric of the Roman world. Their riders could be found raiding cities along the Danube one year and serving as cavalry in Roman armies the next. Yet, despite their growing influence, the Huns were still not a fully centralized power. Authority remained scattered among various tribal leaders, and internal cohesion was fragile. That would change under the leadership of a single man, Ruga. Also known in some sources as Rua or Ruga, Ruga emerged in the historical record as the first Hunnic leader to consolidate real political authority over a broad coalition of Hunnic and allied peoples. His rise marked a turning point in Hunnic history, transforming them from a loosely organized collection of war bands into a centralized military confederation capable of challenging the Roman Empire on its own terms. Ruga's background remains obscure. Like many steppe leaders, he left no written records of his own, and Roman chroniclers provided only brief references to his actions. However, his impact is unmistakable. By the early 430s, Ruga had asserted control over the majority of Hunnic tribes operating in the Carpathian Basin and the western Pontic steppe. This was no small achievement. Hunnic society, like other steppe cultures, was built around kinship ties, clan allegiances, and warrior loyalty. To unify these elements under one leader required not only military strength, but also political acumen and personal charisma. It is likely that Ruga achieved this unification gradually. Through a combination of successful campaigns, strategic marriages, and alliance building, he began to gather a network of subordinate chiefs who recognized his authority. He also benefited from the shifting dynamics of Roman diplomacy. As the Eastern and Western Roman empires negotiated separately with various Hunnic factions, Ruga positioned himself as the principal spokesman for the Huns, demanding that tribute and treaties be handled through his court. The geopolitical conditions of the time favored his rise. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruled by Theodosius II, was increasingly willing to pay tribute in gold in exchange for peace on its northern borders. At the same time, the Western Empire, weakened by internal power struggles and external invasions, relied heavily on Hunnic mercenaries. Ruga exploited both situations. To Constantinople, he presented himself as a powerful ruler to be appeased. To Ravenna, he was an ally who could deliver disciplined cavalry when needed. Under Ruga's leadership, the Huns began to centralize their military operations. Instead of seasonal raids led by independent bands, they launched larger and more coordinated attacks, often with diplomatic preparation. One notable instance occurred in the early 430s, when Ruga's forces threatened the eastern Roman provinces along the lower Danube. The response from Constantinople was swift, not military resistance, but negotiation. The Eastern court agreed to pay an increased annual tribute in gold, effectively recognizing Ruga's dominance and buying a temporary peace. This pattern of tribute payments became a hallmark of Hunnic diplomacy. To the Romans, the payments were often justified as a practical necessity, a way to preserve border security and avoid costly campaigns. But to the Huns, these payments were a form of submission. In steppe culture, tribute carried symbolic meaning. It was not simply financial compensation, but a recognition of superiority. Ruga understood this dual meaning well and used it to elevate his own status, both among the Huns and in the eyes of his Roman counterparts. Internally, Ruga likely used the wealth gained from tribute and plunder to maintain loyalty among his followers. Steppe societies depended on the personal distribution of wealth by leaders. A Khan who could not reward his warriors would quickly lose their allegiance. With Roman gold flowing steadily into Hunnic hands, Ruga was able to finance military campaigns, reward loyal chiefs, and attract new allies. This economic foundation helped stabilize his leadership and laid the groundwork for even greater ambitions. It was also during Ruga's reign that the Huns began to establish a more defined political center in the Carpathian Basin. This fertile region, surrounded by natural mountain barriers, provided an ideal base of operations. It allowed for the grazing of herds, the training of cavalry, and the organization of campaigns. While the Huns did not build cities or fortresses in the Roman sense, they likely established seasonal encampments and administrative centers from which Ruga and his court operated. This shift from constant movement to semi-permanent settlement marked a critical evolution in Hunnic state formation. Ruga's relationship with Rome continued to be marked by both cooperation and tension. He maintained a working alliance with Flavius Aetius, the most powerful general in the Western Empire. Their personal history, Aetius had once been a hostage among the Huns, gave them a foundation of trust. Aetius relied on Hunnic troops to defeat rival factions and maintain order in the West. In return, Ruga received payments, honors, and political leverage. The Eastern Empire, on the other hand, viewed Ruga with more suspicion. His demands for tribute, combined with his periodic raids, were seen as extortion. Yet Theodosius II had little choice but to comply. The Eastern army was already stretched by conflicts in the east and could not afford a full-scale war with the Huns. Thus, Ruga remained in a position of strength, able to exact concessions without engaging in prolonged conflict. In religious matters, Ruga appears to have followed traditional steppe beliefs, likely centered around animism, ancestor worship, and sky gods. There is no evidence that he converted to Christianity or encouraged Roman religious practices among his people. However, the Huns were pragmatic, and they tolerated the customs of their subject peoples. In time, some of these groups, particularly those with closer ties to the empire, would adopt Christianity and other aspects of Roman culture. Ruga died sometime in the mid-440s, likely around the year 434, though the exact date is uncertain. His death marked the end of an era, but also set the stage for a dramatic escalation in Hunnic power. In an unusual display of dynastic succession for a steppe polity, Ruga was succeeded not by a single heir, but by his two nephews, Attila and Bleda. This transition was critical. Rugila's consolidation of power had created a platform from which his successors could build an empire. His unification of the Huns, establishment of regular tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire, and alliance with key figures in the West provided a stable foundation. Attila and Bleda would inherit not just a powerful army but also a functional state. The rise of Rugila represents a fundamental transformation in the history of the Huns. Under his rule, they moved from fragmented bands of warriors to a centralized force capable of directing the course of imperial politics. He did not seek to conquer Rome, but he understood how to extract its wealth and exploit its divisions. His rule was not defined by ideology or conquest for conquest's sake, but by a strategic understanding of power, loyalty, and opportunity. Following the death of Rugila in the early 430s, leadership of the Hunnic Confederation passed not to a single ruler, but to a pair of brothers, Attila and Bleda. This moment marked the beginning of one of the most consequential chapters in Hunnic history. While Rugila had unified the Hunnic factions and established them as a significant force on the European stage, it was under Attila and Bleda that the Huns began to act as an empire in both ambition and scope. Their joint rule introduced a new phase of consolidation, diplomacy, and military pressure, one that would culminate in the Huns becoming the dominant power in Europe during the mid-5th century. Attila and Bleda were nephews of Rugila and likely the sons of his brother Mundzuk, though little is known about their early lives. Both had grown up in the shadow of Rugila's rising power and likely participated in his military campaigns and diplomatic efforts. By the time of their uncle's death, they were already experienced in warfare and familiar with the complexities of Roman politics. Their succession appears to have been accepted by the Hunnic elite without major conflict, at least none recorded in surviving sources. This smooth transfer of power itself is notable, suggesting that Rugila's leadership had not only unified the tribes, but also laid the foundation for dynastic rule. The early years of their co-leadership were marked by efforts to maintain and expand the gains achieved under Rugila. The two brothers divided responsibilities, with each commanding his own following, but both acted in concert when necessary. They oversaw a vast multi-ethnic confederation that included not only Huns, but also subjected or allied peoples such as the Alans, Goths, and various Germanic and Sarmatian groups. Holding such a coalition together required not only strength, but also strategic vision. One of the first major actions undertaken by Attila and Bleda was diplomatic. In the year 435, they concluded the Treaty of Margus with the Eastern Roman Empire. This agreement was a significant development. Under its terms, the Romans agreed to double the annual gold tribute they had been paying to the Huns, return all Hunnic fugitives who had taken refuge in the empire, and open their markets to Hunnic traders. In return, the Huns promised to respect the border and refrain from raiding Roman territory. The Treaty of Margus demonstrated the skillful diplomacy of Attila and Bleda. It was a pragmatic agreement that gave the Huns financial stability and formal recognition as a legitimate power. For the Eastern Roman court, it was a means of buying peace at a time when they were facing threats elsewhere, particularly in the eastern provinces. But this peace would not last. The treaty was not an end in itself, but rather a pause, a breathing space during which both sides assessed their positions and prepared for the next phase. The following years saw an intensification of Hunnic internal organization. Attila and Bleda used the gold acquired through tribute to strengthen their military forces and reward loyal allies. They also continued the process, begun under Rugila, of creating a centralized command structure capable of launching large-scale campaigns. The Carpathian Basin remained their strategic heartland, serving as a base for both political leadership and military logistics. The Huns during this time began to exhibit more formalized leadership structures, while still maintaining many elements of steppe nomadic tradition, including clan-based loyalties and seasonal mobility. The brothers appear to have coordinated their rule through councils and assemblies. Though there is no evidence of a written administrative system, their ability to enforce treaties, collect tribute, and mobilize large armies suggests a functioning, if informal, state apparatus. As the peace with the Eastern Empire wore on, tensions began to rise again. disputes over border control, accusations of treaty violations, and conflicts over the return of fugitives led to a breakdown in relations. In particular, the issue of Roman harboring of Hunnic defectors or prisoners became a recurring flashpoint. For the Huns, this was a matter of honor and sovereignty. For the Romans, it was often a practical decision to retain skilled individuals or avoid handing over political refugees. In the year 440, Attila and Bleda responded with military action. They launched a series of aggressive raids into the Balkans, targeting key Roman cities and fortresses. Their forces crossed the Danube and ravaged parts of Moesia and Thrace. Roman military responses were slow and largely ineffective. The cities of the Balkans were poorly defended, many having been weakened by previous conflicts and by the neglect of imperial resources. The Eastern Court in Constantinople, led by Theodosius II, once again found itself unable to stop the advancing Huns. These raids revealed not only the military strength of the Huns, but also the weakness of Roman frontier defenses. Cities that had once been strongholds now fell quickly or surrendered without a fight. Roman citizens were captured and sold into slavery. Gold, livestock, and supplies were seized in vast quantities. In response, the Eastern Court resumed tribute payments, increasing the sums demanded by the Huns. The cycle of pressure, raid, and payment continued. Throughout this period, the Huns continued to evolve as a diplomatic force. Attila and Bleda received Roman ambassadors, negotiated terms, and communicated demands with increasing sophistication. One surviving account from the Roman diplomat Priscus, who would later visit Attila's court, suggests that the Huns had begun to cultivate a formal sense of diplomacy and royal protocol, even if they retained their traditional nomadic ways. Despite their coordinated rule, there were signs of tension between the two brothers. Sources from the period suggest that Attila was the more ambitious and dynamic of the pair. While Bleda maintained traditional structures and focused on the Eastern Front, Attila showed a greater interest in expanding Hunnic influence and experimenting with new methods of control. This divergence in vision may have planted the seeds of conflict between them. Sometime in the mid-40s of the 5th century, likely around the year 445, Bleda died under unclear circumstances. The sources offer little detail. Some imply that he was killed by Attila in a bid for sole power. Others simply note his passing without comment. In the context of steppe politics, both possibilities are plausible. Fratricide was not uncommon when succession was contested or when a more ambitious sibling sought to consolidate control. With Bleda's death, Attila assumed sole leadership of the Hunnic Confederation. This moment marked a profound transformation. Under dual leadership, the Huns had functioned as a formidable power. Under Attila alone, they would become an empire that threatened the entire Roman world. Before this transformation, however, the period of joint rule had already reshaped the political landscape of Europe. The Huns had moved from opportunistic raiders to organized power brokers. They had extracted vast wealth from the Eastern Empire, influenced Western politics, and demonstrated the capacity to sustain long-term military operations. Attila and Bleda had proven that the Huns were not a passing threat, but a permanent force in the geopolitics of the late antique world. The Treaty of Margus, signed in the year 435, was a diplomatic milestone that reflected the increasingly complex relationship between the Eastern Roman Empire and the rising power of the Huns. It was the first formal agreement negotiated between the two entities during the co-rule of Attila and Bleda. This treaty was not merely a response to military threats, it was a calculated arrangement grounded in political leverage, economic necessity, and strategic maneuvering. The agreement would shape the nature of Roman-Hunnic interactions for the next several years and lay the groundwork for both future conflict and cooperation. By the time of the treaty, the Huns had already become a dominant presence in the Carpathian Basin. Their campaigns under Ruga had proven their capacity to influence Roman politics and apply military pressure with impunity. Attila and Bleda inherited not only this power, but also the responsibility of managing the complex relationship with Constantinople. Rather than launching an immediate campaign, the brothers began their rule by turning to diplomacy. The Treaty of Margus was negotiated in the Roman city of Margus, located on the Danube frontier in what is now modern Serbia. The Roman delegation was led by high-ranking officials from the Eastern Court of Theodosius II, whose reign was marked by a preference for buying peace rather than fighting extended wars. For the Huns, this was an opportunity to secure legitimacy, wealth, and recognition as sovereign rulers. The terms of the treaty reflected the military advantage held by the Huns at the time. The Eastern Roman Empire agreed to several significant concessions. First, it pledged to double its annual tribute to the Huns, from 300 pounds of gold to 600. In the Roman monetary system, this was a considerable sum, and it represented a direct transfer of imperial resources to a foreign power. Second, the Romans promised to return any Hunnic fugitives who had sought asylum within imperial borders. These individuals may have been defectors, political rivals, or prisoners of war. From the Hunnic perspective, their return was a matter of both honor and control. Third, the treaty required the opening of Roman markets to Hunnic merchants, especially at designated trading centers along the frontier. Trade had always been a key feature of steppe sedentary interactions, and the Huns sought greater access to Roman goods, including luxury items, tools, weapons, and textiles. For their part, the Huns offered raw materials, livestock, and military services. The Romans hoped that facilitating commerce would help stabilize relations and provide a channel for peaceful engagement. In exchange for these concessions, Attila and Bleda promised to halt their raids and respect the Danube frontier. At least in theory, this marked a period of peace. But in practice, the treaty was fragile. The very structure of the agreement revealed a deep asymmetry. The Romans paid to be left alone, while the Huns used the treaty to enrich and empower themselves. For Attila and Bleda, the tribute was not simply a payoff, it was a tribute to their status and power. The treaty also had important symbolic implications. It signaled to other barbarian groups that the Huns were now on equal footing with the Roman Empire, at least diplomatically. This prestige helped solidify Attila and Bleda's authority over their diverse coalition of subjects and allies. The influx of Roman gold allowed them to reward loyal followers, fund military campaigns, and expand their political influence. For several years after the signing of the Treaty of Margus, a tense peace prevailed. Attila and Bleda focused on consolidating their control over the Hunnic Confederation and refining their military capabilities. At the same time, they closely monitored Roman behavior. Any perceived violation of the treaty, whether a delay in tribute payments or the failure to return a fugitive, could serve as justification for renewed hostilities. Tensions began to rise again when Roman authorities, either through negligence or defiance, failed to comply with all the terms of the agreement. One particularly provocative incident involved the Bishop of Margus, who was accused by the Huns of crossing the Danube and looting royal Hunnic tombs. This act, if true, would have been seen as a grave violation of sacred tradition and an insult to Hunnic sovereignty. Rather than surrender the bishop, the Roman authorities hesitated. When pressed by the Huns, the bishop reportedly betrayed his own city and handed it over to Attila's forces. This allowed the Huns to cross the Danube and sack Margus, violating the very peace the treaty was supposed to preserve. The Eastern Roman response was limited and ineffective. Rather than launching a counteroffensive, the court in Constantinople sought to renegotiate. In the years that followed, Attila and Bleda launched additional raids into Roman territory, citing breaches of the treaty as justification. Cities along the Danube, particularly in Moesia and Dacia, were plundered. Roman fortresses were bypassed or overrun, and large numbers of captives were taken. These attacks were not random acts of violence. They were calculated demonstrations of power, designed to pressure the Romans into resuming and increasing their payments. By the early 440s, the Eastern Roman Empire resumed tribute, this time under even harsher conditions. The annual gold payment was raised once more, and additional clauses were added to guarantee the free movement of Hunnic merchants and envoys. Theodosius II, though criticized by some in his court for weakness, viewed this strategy as necessary to preserve stability in the East while maintaining focus on other priorities, including religious policy and internal reform. These renewed payments served multiple purposes for the Huns. Economically, they enriched the elite and funded the military machine. Politically, they reinforced Attila and Bleda's control over their allies. Strategically, they weakened Roman resolve and demonstrated that the empire could be coerced without the need for full-scale invasion. Each payment was a sign of submission, proof that the Eastern court feared Hunnic power. The effectiveness of this system emboldened the Huns. Attila in particular began to realize that the Eastern Roman Empire could be manipulated through a combination of force and diplomacy. He studied Roman diplomatic customs, received envoys, and engaged in correspondence with imperial officials. He began to present himself not merely as a tribal leader, but as a ruler equal to the emperors of Constantinople and Ravenna. The Treaty of Margus, then, was far more than a temporary peace agreement. It was a turning point in Hunnic-Roman relations. It demonstrated that the Huns were now capable of shaping regional politics through negotiation as well as warfare. It gave them access to the economic lifeblood of the empire and allowed them to operate within Roman systems of diplomacy and law, even while remaining outside its cultural and administrative structures. This evolution posed new challenges for the Roman world. The Huns were no longer an external problem to be solved with border defenses and punitive expeditions. They were now an integrated element of late Roman geopolitics, alternately allies, enemies, and rivals. Their leaders understood Roman priorities and weaknesses and used that knowledge to their advantage. As tribute payments increased and Hunnic influence grew, it became increasingly clear that the peace was unsustainable. The Eastern Roman Empire could only pay for safety for so long. Sooner or later, the Huns would seek more than gold. They would demand recognition, territory, or perhaps dominance over imperial institutions themselves. By the middle of the 5th century, the Hunnic Empire stood at a critical juncture. Its power had grown steadily through a mix of tribute extraction, military campaigns, and diplomacy. The joint leadership of Attila and Bleda had achieved notable successes, particularly in their dealings with the Eastern Roman Empire. However, the era of shared rule was coming to an end. In a decisive and poorly documented event, Bleda vanished from the historical record, leaving Attila as the sole ruler of the Huns. From that moment onward, the Hunnic Confederation would be defined by the personality, ambition, and vision of a single man. The circumstances of Bleda's death remain unclear. No detailed contemporary account survives, and the few references that do exist are vague. Some Roman chroniclers imply that Attila orchestrated his brother's death to gain full control over the empire. Others simply state that Bleda died around the year 445, offering no further explanation. Given the norms of steppe politics, where rivalry, fratricide, and ambition were not uncommon, the idea of Attila eliminating Bleda for power is entirely plausible. But without concrete evidence, historians are left to consider motive and outcome rather than direct causality. What is certain is that following Bleda's disappearance, Attila emerged as the undisputed leader of the Huns. This transition marked a fundamental change in how the empire operated. Under shared leadership, power had been divided and actions often required consensus. Now, with authority concentrated in Attila's hands, decisions could be made more swiftly and executed more forcefully. This centralization allowed for greater coordination across the vast and ethnically diverse territories controlled by the Huns. Attila's rise to sole power coincided with a notable escalation in Hunnic military activity. With Bleda gone, Attila no longer needed to divide spoils, share authority, or negotiate internal priorities. He quickly turned his attention to renewing pressure on the Eastern Roman Empire, which had resumed tribute payments following earlier campaigns, but was still perceived as vulnerable. Attila believed that the Romans had not fully honored the terms of their agreements, particularly concerning the return of fugitives and the opening of trade centers. These grievances, real or constructed, provided a convenient justification for renewed hostilities. One of Attila's first major actions as sole ruler was to demand a renegotiation of the previous treaties. He sent envoys to Constantinople with a list of complaints, including accusations that Roman merchants had cheated Hunnic traders and that imperial authorities had continued to harbor deserters. His tone was forceful, and his demands were clear. He wanted an increase in annual payments, stricter enforcement of treaty terms, and formal recognition of Hunnic rights within imperial trading zones. The Eastern Roman court, under Emperor Theodosius II, responded cautiously. The empire had recently suffered natural disasters and was dealing with internal instability. Theodosius preferred to avoid direct confrontation, especially after witnessing the devastation of earlier Hunnic raids. However, appeasement did not prevent conflict. When Roman responses proved slow or evasive, Attila began to prepare for war. This new phase of conflict began with a large-scale invasion of the Balkans. In the late 440s, Attila led a powerful and well-organized army across the Danube River, striking deep into Roman territory. His forces bypassed heavily fortified cities and focused instead on less defended targets, small towns, trade routes, and logistical centers. This strategy allowed him to move quickly, gather resources, and demoralize the Roman population without risking prolonged sieges. One of the most significant aspects of these campaigns was the sheer scale of destruction. Hunnic forces ravaged the provinces of Moesia, Dacia, and Thrace, destroying infrastructure, enslaving populations, and forcing the flight of entire communities. Roman military commanders were unable to mount an effective defense, as many troops had been redeployed elsewhere or were simply outmatched by the speed and coordination of Attila's cavalry. Attila's military success during these years was not simply a product of brute force. His tactics reflected a deep understanding of psychological warfare. He often allowed news of his approach to spread ahead of his army, sowing panic and encouraging cities to surrender without resistance. Roman citizens fled in large numbers, and many towns chose to open their gates rather than face the possibility of destruction. This allowed Attila to preserve his forces, conserve supplies, and maintain momentum. At the same time, Attila continued to engage in diplomacy. Even as his armies swept through the Balkans, he maintained communication with Roman envoys. His strategy was twofold: use military pressure to extract concessions while presenting himself as a ruler who preferred peace if treated with respect. He insisted on the honor of agreements, the return of fugitives, and proper diplomatic protocol. This dual approach, military aggression paired with controlled negotiation, was a hallmark of Attila's leadership. The Eastern Roman response remained constrained. Emperor Theodosius authorized additional tribute payments and sent ambassadors to negotiate a halt to the invasions. The resulting agreements increased the annual gold tribute and reaffirmed earlier terms. Yet Attila's demands continued to grow. With each campaign, he demonstrated that Roman gold could be extracted through fear and that the empire lacked the military strength to impose its will. Attila also began to display signs of personal ambition beyond mere tribute collection. He referred to himself as the Scourge of God, a title that emphasized both his perceived divine role and his authority over Christian empires. While he did not convert to Christianity himself, he showed familiarity with Christian rhetoric and symbolism, often using them to his advantage in negotiations with Roman officials. Internally, Attila maintained control over his diverse empire through a combination of reward, intimidation, and centralized planning. His court, located somewhere in the Hungarian plain, functioned as both a military headquarters and a political center. It included not only Hunnic nobles but also representatives from subject peoples, Goths, Alans, Gepids, and others. These groups were granted autonomy in exchange for loyalty and military service. Attila used tribute gold to reward allies and maintain the loyalty of key commanders. Culturally, the Hunnic Empire under Attila began to adopt more formalized structures. While still fundamentally nomadic, the court took on ceremonial aspects drawn from both steppe traditions and Roman influence. Visitors described a court that, while austere compared to Roman opulence, exhibited clear protocols, ranks, and administrative routines. Attila positioned himself as a monarch, not in the Roman sense of institutionalized emperorship, but in the steppe tradition of a paramount Khan with divine sanction and unchallenged authority. One of the most vivid descriptions of Attila's court comes from Priscus, a Roman diplomat who visited in the late 440s. Priscus reported a structured and hierarchical environment, with Attila seated in a wooden hall surrounded by guards, advisors, and foreign envoys. He described Attila as modest in appearance, wearing simple clothes and eating plain food, yet commanding enormous respect and fear. This image reinforced the notion that Attila's power was not based on extravagance, but on discipline, charisma, and control. The death of Bleda and Attila's assumption of sole leadership brought clarity to Hunnic governance. The empire now moved according to the will of a single ruler, one who understood how to wield both the sword and the treaty scroll. Attila had absorbed the lessons of previous decades, lessons about Roman weakness, the power of psychological warfare, and the importance of centralized command. Under his rule, the Huns no longer acted as mere raiders or opportunists. They became the dominant force in Europe, capable of influencing the fate of empires. Following the death of Bleda and the consolidation of power under Attila, the Hunnic Empire entered its most aggressive and transformative phase. With full control over a vast and increasingly centralized confederation, Attila now moved with purpose and singular authority. The Eastern Roman Empire, weakened by internal crises and previous military humiliations, stood directly in his sights. What followed was not merely a series of raids, it was a sustained and systematic campaign that brought the Eastern Roman world to its knees and marked the pinnacle of Hunnic power in the Balkans. By the middle of the 5th century, the relationship between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Huns had deteriorated beyond repair. The treaty frameworks that had once governed peace and tribute were now broken. Disputes over trade access, fugitives, and payments had become pretexts for war. But these grievances, while important, were also strategic tools. Attila no longer sought only gold. His ambitions had grown. He now aimed to force the Eastern Roman Empire into complete submission, or at the very least, to prove that it could not resist his will. In the year traditionally assigned to the beginning of this campaign, somewhere around 447, Attila launched his most devastating invasion of the Eastern Roman Balkans. His army, drawn from across the Hunnic world and reinforced by subject peoples including Ostrogoths, Alans, and Gepids, was immense by the standards of the day. It operated with a level of coordination and mobility that few Roman commanders could match. Unlike earlier raids, which were swift and focused, this campaign was prolonged, methodical, and ruthless. The Hunnic forces crossed the Danube and advanced into Roman territory with little resistance. The imperial army, caught unprepared and outmaneuvered, struggled to mobilize. Town after town fell to the invaders. Cities such as Naissus, modern-day Niš, were utterly destroyed. According to later accounts, Naissus was so thoroughly plundered and razed that it ceased to function as a meaningful urban center for years, perhaps even decades. Roman chroniclers described the devastation in stark terms. Walls reduced to rubble, entire populations enslaved or massacred, fields burned, and churches desecrated. The geography of the campaign reveals a deliberate strategy. Attila did not attack Constantinople directly. Instead, he targeted the heartland of the Balkans, striking at the network of cities, fortresses, and roads that supported the Eastern Empire's regional infrastructure. This approach served multiple purposes. It deprived the empire of resources, created widespread panic, and sent a clear message to the court of Theodosius II. Nowhere was safe. One of the defining features of this campaign was the systematic use of siege warfare. While the Huns had traditionally relied on mobility and open-field tactics, they now demonstrated an ability to assault fortified cities. Subject peoples within the Hunnic army likely played a key role in these operations. The Ostrogoths, for example, had long experience with Roman-style warfare and could assist in building siege equipment, scaling walls, and navigating defensive structures. This adaptation showcased Attila's growing military sophistication. In response, the Eastern Roman government was thrown into a state of panic. Refugees flooded into safer regions, bringing tales of destruction and horror. Bishops and civic leaders appealed to the emperor for protection, but the imperial army remained largely ineffective. Theodosius II, who had long relied on diplomacy and tribute to manage foreign threats, now found that these strategies had reached their limit. Faced with a crisis of existential proportions, the Eastern Roman court attempted a desperate combination of defensive construction and renewed negotiation. The famed Theodosian walls of Constantinople, already among the most formidable in the world, were reinforced. Efforts were made to rebuild defensive positions along the Balkan frontier, though with limited success given the rapid pace of Hunnic advancement. Most importantly, the court sent envoys to Attila to negotiate terms for peace. Among the most notable Roman emissaries was Anatolius, a prominent general and diplomat who had previously served in high-ranking military roles. His mission was to halt the Hunnic advance through negotiation and to re-establish some form of agreement. Attila, now at the height of his power, received the embassy with the authority of a sovereign who dictated terms rather than discussed them. The resulting negotiations led to an unprecedented humiliation for the Eastern Empire. The annual tribute was tripled to more than 2,000 pounds of gold. Additionally, a lump sum payment was required to compensate for earlier alleged treaty violations. This sum, according to later sources, amounted to more than 6,000 pounds of gold. The Romans also agreed to withdraw from a broad strip of land along the Danube, creating a buffer zone under Hunnic control. This territorial concession was as significant as the financial ones, for it marked a clear retreat of imperial authority. Attila's campaign had achieved its goals. He had forced the empire into a position of submission without even approaching its capital. The cities of the Balkans lay in ruins. The treasury of Constantinople had been emptied, and the Eastern Roman military had been exposed as incapable of defending its provinces. In step terms, this was the confirmation of Attila's supremacy. He had not merely defeated an enemy, he had dominated a world power through superior force and strategic leverage. Culturally and psychologically, the impact on the Eastern Roman population was profound. Attila was now more than a political or military threat. He had become a symbol of divine punishment, a figure of fear and awe. Some Christian writers interpreted his invasion as a scourge sent by God to chastise the sins of the empire. The idea of Attila as the scourge of God took root during this time, cementing his legacy in both Eastern and Western traditions. Yet despite this overwhelming success, Attila did not seek to occupy Roman territory permanently. This was consistent with his broader strategy. The Huns, even at the height of their power, remained a mobile and non-sedentary people. They lacked the administrative systems to govern large urban populations or maintain distant provinces. What they sought instead was wealth, recognition, and strategic leverage. Once those were achieved, withdrawal was not seen as a retreat, but as the natural conclusion of a successful campaign. The wealth extracted from the Eastern Roman Empire in this period flowed directly into the Hunnic core. It financed new campaigns, rewarded loyal chiefs, and reinforced Attila's authority. His court, located somewhere in the central plains of modern-day Hungary, became the epicenter of power in Eastern Europe. Envoys from distant lands, including the Western Roman Empire and possibly even Sassanid Persia, began to appear at his court, seeking alliances, favor, or peace. This surge in prestige marked the high point of Attila's Eastern policy. He had proven that Constantinople could not stop him, that treaties could be rewritten at will, and that the gold of the empire could be claimed through force. Yet he also understood the limits of this approach. Sustained campaigns in the East were costly, and the constant drain on subject populations risked internal dissent. Having secured what he wanted in the Balkans, Attila now turned his eyes westward, where a different set of opportunities and challenges awaited. After years of dominance over the Eastern Roman Empire, Attila had extracted immense wealth, political concessions, and territorial leverage. The Balkans lay ravaged, Roman diplomacy had been humbled, and Attila's reputation as the most powerful man in Europe had been cemented. Yet, with the Eastern Empire temporarily pacified and the Hunnic Confederation flush with gold and momentum, Attila began to look westward. His ambitions turned toward the Western Roman Empire, where political instability, aristocratic intrigue, and imperial weakness presented a new opportunity for expansion and pressure. The Western Roman Empire in the mid-5th century was a fractured and vulnerable polity. Its capital had long since moved from Rome to Ravenna, a city more defensible but symbolically removed from the heart of Roman tradition. The emperor at the time, Valentinian III, held little personal authority. Real power lay with his general and advisor, Flavius Aetius, a man who had spent much of his career navigating civil war, barbarian invasions, and the shifting allegiances of a crumbling imperial structure. Aetius was a seasoned military leader and a skilled political operator. He had previously formed alliances with the Huns, including Attila himself, and had used Hunnic forces to defeat rival factions within the Western Empire. Yet despite this history of cooperation, relations between the Western court and Attila had grown increasingly strained. The political climate was shifting, and the balance of power was no longer in Rome's favor. The pretext for Attila's intervention in the West came in the form of a scandal involving the imperial family. Honoria, the sister of Emperor Valentinian III, found herself at the center of court intrigue. According to multiple sources, Honoria had been forced into a politically expedient betrothal against her will. In protest, she sent a plea for rescue, along with her personal ring, to Attila. Whether her message constituted a marriage proposal is still debated, but Attila interpreted it as such. Seizing upon the gesture, he claimed that Honoria was now his betrothed and that he had a legitimate right to half of the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. This claim was, of course, not taken seriously by the Roman court, which dismissed it as absurd and politically untenable. Emperor Valentinian III rejected the proposal outright, and the Roman elite treated it as a provocation. But for Attila, it was a golden opportunity. He had found a justification, however flimsy, to launch a military campaign into the Western Empire under the guise of restoring his supposed bride's honor and securing his lawful inheritance. The situation in Gaul provided fertile ground for such a campaign. The region, while technically under Roman control, was fragmented. Local Roman governors operated with relative autonomy, and large portions of the countryside were dominated by semi-independent barbarian kingdoms, including the Visigoths under Theodoric I, the Burgundians, and the Franks. These groups maintained uneasy relationships with both the Roman state and each other, frequently switching allegiances or asserting their own interests. In this fractured environment, Attila saw opportunity. A successful campaign into Gaul could achieve multiple objectives: the extension of Hunnic influence into the western provinces, the weakening of Roman political control, the subjugation of rival barbarian groups, and the extraction of additional tribute or territory. With this vision in mind, Attila began to assemble a massive army, one composed not only of Huns, but also of loyal subject peoples from across his empire, including Ostrogoths, Alans, Gepids, and Sarmatians. By the spring of what is traditionally dated to the year 451, Attila's army crossed the Rhine and entered Gaul. The invasion was swift and brutal. City after city fell before the advancing horde. Metz, Reims, and Cambrai were among the first to be attacked, and their fates were grim. Churches were looted, populations enslaved, and infrastructure laid to waste. The speed and scale of Attila's advance created panic throughout Gaul. Refugees poured into southern cities, and the Roman administration struggled to coordinate a coherent defense. The city of Lutetia, later known as Paris, was spared, but only narrowly. According to later legends, including those associated with Saint Genevieve, the people of the city prayed for deliverance, and Attila bypassed the city. While this account carries hagiographic overtones, it reflects the fear that gripped urban populations across the region. The true prize of the campaign, however, was the wealthy city of Aurelianum, modern-day Orléans. Strategically located and heavily fortified, it was a crucial node in the Gallic defense network. Attila besieged the city, and according to accounts, its fall seemed imminent. But by this time, the Western Roman Empire had finally mustered a response. Flavius Aetius had forged an alliance with the Visigoths, led by Theodoric I, and together they raised a coalition army composed of Romans, Visigoths, Franks, and other regional forces. This alliance was rare in its breadth and urgency, and it marked a temporary unification of often competing interests. As Attila pressed his siege of Aurelianum, news reached him that Aetius and Theodoric were approaching with a large army. Realizing that he risked being caught between the city's defenders and the advancing coalition, Attila chose to withdraw. He retreated northeast toward the plains of Catalaunum, where he prepared for a decisive confrontation. The stage was now set for one of the most famous battles of late antiquity. While the battle itself would be covered in the next chapter, the lead-up to the clash reveals several key aspects of Attila's strategy and the political realities of the Western Roman world. First, Attila was no longer simply a steppe warlord raiding for plunder. He was asserting claims over territory, political legitimacy, and dynastic rights. His invocation of Honoria's offer, whether sincere or cynical, demonstrated his ability to manipulate Roman political norms to his advantage. Second, the invasion of Gaul marked a shift from reactive warfare to calculated imperial expansion. Attila moved with deliberate intent, targeted strategic cities, and sought to impose his will not only on the Romans, but also on their barbarian allies. The campaign was not a mere raid, it was an assertion of hegemony in the western provinces. Third, the response of the Western Roman Empire revealed both its fragility and its capacity for short-term cohesion. Aetius, drawing on his extensive network of alliances, managed to rally a coalition that had eluded his predecessors. The unity achieved on the battlefield was fleeting, but it showed that under existential threat, Rome could still call upon its traditions of military organization and diplomatic flexibility. As Attila withdrew from the siege of Aurelianum and prepared for battle on the open plains, he carried with him the spoils of countless towns, the momentum of a victorious campaign, and the expectation that yet another Roman army would fall before him. The West, however, was not the East. The battle that followed would challenge his ambitions in ways not seen before. In the long and turbulent history of the Roman Empire, few events stand out with as much dramatic intensity and strategic consequence as the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. Fought in the heart of Gaul, this monumental clash was not simply a confrontation between two military forces. It was a turning point in the late ancient world. The battle pitted Attila the Hun, at the height of his power, against a Roman-led coalition fighting to preserve the last vestiges of imperial control in the West. Though the outcome was not an unambiguous victory for either side, the battle marked the beginning of a slow shift in momentum that would ultimately halt Attila's westward ambitions. Following the rapid and brutal advance of Attila's forces through northern Gaul, culminating in the near capture of Aurelianum, the Western Roman general Flavius Aetius recognized that immediate action was required. Time was running out, and Attila had shown no signs of stopping. Recognizing that no single force in the West could match the Huns alone, Aetius orchestrated a diplomatic feat that had rarely been seen in the chaotic political landscape of the 5th century. He formed a multinational coalition. The core of this alliance was the Roman army, still functioning but severely diminished from its former imperial strength. To this, he added the Visigoths under Theodoric I, a powerful king whose domain centered on Tolosa, modern-day Toulouse. Though the Visigoths had often been enemies of Rome, their interests now aligned. The Huns posed a direct threat to their territory and autonomy. Aetius also recruited contingents from the Franks, the Burgundians, and several other local groups. Together, this polyglot force represented the most significant military assembly the West had seen in years. Attila, aware of the coalition forming against him, chose the battleground carefully. He withdrew to the open plains near Catalaunum, an area well suited for his cavalry-based army. Unlike urban warfare or siege operations, which required logistical support and siegecraft, the flat terrain of the plains allowed his horse archers to operate at maximum efficiency. The date of the battle is commonly placed in the summer of the year, traditionally marked as 451. When the armies met, both sides were massive by the standards of the time. Though no reliable figures survive, estimates suggest that tens of thousands of men participated. The terrain was open and dry, which favored the mobility of the Hunnic cavalry. Attila arranged his army with the Huns in the center, flanked by allied Germanic tribes such as the Ostrogoths and Gepids. Aetius and Theodoric deployed their forces in a similar fashion, with Romans and Franks on one wing, Visigoths on the other, and a central Roman command corps. The battle began with skirmishes and probing attacks, as each side tested the other's defenses. Attila launched a series of frontal assaults, hoping to break through the center and scatter the coalition forces. His cavalry surged forward in waves, unleashing volleys of arrows while remaining out of reach of Roman infantry. But the Roman lines, reinforced by heavy infantry and Visigothic troops, held firm. The fighting quickly became chaotic and brutal, with no clear advantage emerging for either side. The turning point came late in the day when Theodoric I led a charge against Attila's flank. The Visigothic king, already an experienced battlefield commander, recognized that a decisive push could collapse the Hunnic line. His troops fought fiercely, driving back the Ostrogothic allies of Attila and threatening to envelop the Hunnic center. However, in the midst of the fighting, Theodoric was killed, either struck down by enemy weapons or trampled by his own cavalry. The death of Theodoric could have demoralized the Visigoths and caused the coalition to falter. Instead, it galvanized them. His son, Thorismund, assumed command and pressed the assault. Roman forces under Aetius, coordinating with their allies, continued to hold the line and exploit weaknesses in the Hunnic formation. As night fell, the battlefield remained contested, but Attila's army had failed to break through and now found itself in a precarious position. Fearing encirclement and the loss of his baggage train, Attila ordered a withdrawal to a fortified camp constructed with wagons in a defensive circle, a traditional steppe tactic designed for protection during emergencies. There, he braced for a possible counterattack. For a time, it seemed that the coalition might press the advantage and destroy the Hunnic army entirely. Yet Aetius, ever calculating, chose restraint. The reasons for Aetius's decision not to pursue Attila remain the subject of debate. Some historians suggest he feared that eliminating Attila would empower the Visigoths too much, threatening Roman interests in Gaul. Others argue that the Roman forces were exhausted or that logistical constraints prevented a prolonged campaign. Regardless of the motive, the decision allowed Attila to retreat from the battlefield with his army intact. Strategically, the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains was a setback for Attila. It was the first time he had encountered serious resistance in the West, and the loss of momentum weakened his aura of invincibility. He had failed to achieve his objectives in Gaul, and his army had suffered heavy casualties. Although not a decisive defeat, the battle marked the end of his initiative in the region. For the Western Roman Empire, the battle was a rare and desperately needed success. It proved that, with the right leadership and alliances, Rome could still stand against overwhelming threats. Flavius Aetius was hailed as the last of the Romans, a man whose strategic brilliance and diplomatic skill had preserved the Western Empire for a time. The Visigoths, despite losing their king, emerged with greater prestige and influence, while Thorismund returned to Tolosa as a victorious successor. The broader implications of the battle extended beyond the immediate military outcomes. It reinforced the fragile balance of power in Western Europe. The Huns, while still dangerous, were no longer seen as an unstoppable force. The Western Roman aristocracy gained a brief reprieve from the collapse that had seemed imminent. And among the various barbarian kingdoms, a new sense of independence and regional identity began to grow. Attila, for his part, did not abandon his ambitions. His withdrawal from Gaul was not a surrender, but a strategic recalibration. His court remained powerful, his army remained intact, and his resources, drawn from years of tribute and plunder, were still substantial. He had lost a battle, not the war. Even as he regrouped, he began to prepare for his next great campaign. This time, it would not be Gaul that faced his fury. It would be Italy itself. Following the stalemate at the Catalaunian Plains, Attila returned eastward with his army bruised but not broken. Though he had failed to secure Gaul and had suffered significant losses, his power remained formidable. His reputation as the scourge of empires had not yet faded, and his ambitions had not diminished. Indeed, his attention now turned southward, to the heartland of the Roman world itself. In the wake of his campaign in Gaul, Attila prepared for what would become his final and perhaps most audacious military endeavor, the invasion of Italy. The Western Roman Empire, still reeling from years of crisis, was in no position to mount a unified or effective defense. Emperor Valentinian III remained on the throne, but his authority was weak, and political divisions continued to paralyze the imperial court at Ravenna. Flavius Aetius, though celebrated as a hero after Catalaunum, had struggled to maintain the cohesion of his diverse coalition. The Visigoths had returned to their own territories, and other allies had withdrawn their support. Italy stood exposed, vulnerable, and largely undefended. Attila, ever the strategist, recognized this opportunity. His campaign into Italy began in earnest in the spring of what is generally marked as the year 452. He crossed the Julian Alps and descended into the northern plains of Italy with a multi-ethnic army composed of Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, and other subordinate groups. These forces had recovered from their losses in Gaul and were now prepared for a new offensive aimed at the symbolic and political core of the Western Empire. One of Attila's first targets was the city of Aquileia, a wealthy and well-fortified city located near the northeastern frontier. It was a crucial military and economic center, guarding the approaches to northern Italy. According to accounts from later chroniclers, the siege of Aquileia was bitter and prolonged. The city resisted fiercely, and Attila's forces initially struggled to breach its defenses. However, after several weeks, perhaps longer, the Huns succeeded in breaking through. Aquileia was utterly destroyed. Its walls were torn down, its population slaughtered or enslaved, and its buildings burned. So complete was the devastation that the city never fully recovered. In the centuries that followed, its ruins served as a haunting reminder of the Huns' passage. The fall of Aquileia sent shockwaves through the Italian peninsula. Panic spread among cities and towns throughout the north. Roman administrators and citizens alike fled southward in search of refuge. Some took shelter in the marshes of the Venetian lagoon, laying the foundations for what would later become the city of Venice. Others retreated behind the walls of more defensible cities such as Milan and Ravenna. Attila's army, emboldened by their success, moved swiftly through the Po Valley. They sacked city after city. Verona, Vicenza, Padua, and others all fell before the advancing horde. The pattern of destruction was consistent. Cities were looted, temples and churches were plundered, and captives were taken in great numbers. The Roman army, unable to field a force large enough to stop the invasion, remained largely passive. Flavius Aetius, perhaps recognizing the futility of open battle without sufficient support, adopted a strategy of observation and containment rather than confrontation. Yet, despite the devastation, Attila did not march directly on Rome. His reasons remain a subject of speculation and debate among historians. Some argue that logistical concerns played a role. The Hunnic army was far from its supply base, and northern Italy had already been stripped of much of its food and resources. Others suggest that Attila was wary of the symbolic weight of sacking the Eternal City, particularly after the Visigoths under Alaric had done so only a few decades earlier. There may also have been concern about overextending his forces in unfamiliar and rugged territory. Instead, Attila halted his advance near the River Po and began negotiations. The turning point came with the arrival of a Roman delegation led by Pope Leo I, accompanied by senior Roman officials, including the consul Avienus and the prefect Trigetius. The exact content of the negotiations between Attila and the Pope remains unknown. Later, Christian sources ascribe miraculous influence to Pope Leo, suggesting that his piety and authority persuaded Attila to withdraw. Some even claim that Attila saw visions of saints or angels threatening him should he harm the city of Rome. However, more pragmatic factors likely influenced the decision. Disease was spreading in the Hunnic camp. Famine loomed in the war-torn regions of northern Italy, and Eastern Roman forces were reportedly mobilizing to threaten Hunnic territories across the Danube. Faced with mounting logistical and strategic risks, Attila may have concluded that further advance was not worth the cost. Whatever the true reasons, the result was clear. Attila agreed to withdraw from Italy without besieging Rome itself. The departure of Attila's army from Italy was not an act of defeat, but it marked the end of his last great campaign. Though the Huns remained a powerful force, their momentum had begun to falter. The campaign into Italy had yielded plunder and terror, but no lasting territorial gain. The cities destroyed, the lives lost, and the fear generated had all served to demonstrate Hunnic might. Yet they had also revealed the limits of what such might could achieve in the long term. For the Western Roman Empire, the invasion was both a catastrophe and a reprieve. Entire regions of northern Italy were left in ruins, and the imperial treasury was further depleted. Yet the symbolic survival of Rome itself offered a brief glimmer of hope. Pope Leo's role in the negotiations elevated the prestige of the papacy and contributed to the emerging idea of spiritual authority in the face of political collapse. Attila, meanwhile, returned to his base in the Hungarian plains. Despite the setbacks in Gaul and Italy, he remained the most feared figure in Europe. His court continued to receive embassies from across the continent. He was planning new campaigns, possibly against the Eastern Roman Empire once again, or perhaps deeper into Western territories. The Hunnic Confederation, though stretched by years of warfare, was still intact and formidable. After years of ceaseless warfare, unparalleled conquests, and psychological dominance over two empires, Attila the Hun stood at the pinnacle of his power. His campaigns had devastated the Balkans, terrified the Roman West, and left entire cities in ashes. Yet, in the prime of his strength, when no army had managed to defeat him outright, Attila died suddenly, without a sword being drawn, without a battle being fought. His death, shrouded in mystery and surrounded by legend, marked the end of an era for the Huns and sent ripples across the world he had helped shape. The circumstances of Attila's death remain one of the most discussed enigmas of late antiquity. According to the most widely accepted account provided by the Roman diplomat and historian Priscus, Attila died in the early spring following his Italian campaign, likely in the year traditionally placed as 453. The event occurred not on a battlefield, but during a celebration, his wedding night. By that time, Attila had already taken many wives, as was customary among steppe rulers. Marriage was not only a personal union, but also a political tool, used to bind allied tribes and noble families to the supreme leader. On this occasion, the bride was a young woman named Ildiko, described in later sources as a beautiful girl of Germanic origin. The marriage itself was part of a larger pattern of Attila's diplomacy, cementing loyalty, rewarding allies, and maintaining internal cohesion within his vast, multi-ethnic empire. The wedding feast was lavish by Hunnic standards. Priscus notes that Attila was known for his moderation in drinking and for presenting himself with austere dignity even during celebrations. Yet on this night, whether overcome by festivity or encouraged by his companions, he reportedly indulged more heavily in food and wine than usual. After retiring to his chambers with his new bride, Attila was found dead the following morning. The official explanation, accepted by many contemporary and near-contemporary sources, was that Attila suffered a massive hemorrhage, either from a ruptured blood vessel or from choking on his own blood due to a severe nosebleed. Some suggest that his excessive drinking caused him to fall into a deep sleep, during which he was unable to wake as the bleeding began. Others propose that a pre-existing medical condition may have contributed, though no specifics are given in ancient texts. However, this natural explanation did not satisfy everyone. Almost immediately, rumors and suspicions spread. Some claimed that Ildiko, the new bride, had assassinated Attila, possibly under orders or as part of a revenge plot. The theory of poisoning was also considered, though no direct evidence supports it. In the cultural imagination of both friends and enemies, it seemed almost unbelievable that such a powerful and feared man could die in so mundane a fashion. A violent end, perhaps in battle or at the hands of a rival, would have better suited the legend of Attila. His quiet death in a tent on a night of celebration invited alternative interpretations and layers of myth. Regardless of the cause, the impact of Attila's death was immediate and profound. His body was treated with the highest possible honors. Priscus records that his warriors engaged in a ritual mourning that included loud lamentations, dirges, and the mutilation of their own faces, a sign of grief and loyalty common among some steppe traditions. The blood they shed was meant to honor their fallen leader, who had never bled in defeat. The funeral of Attila was conducted in great secrecy. According to legend, he was buried in a triple coffin, the innermost made of gold, the next of silver, and the outermost of iron. The iron symbolized his military strength, the silver his wealth, and the gold his glory. The location of his burial was deliberately hidden. Slaves who dug the grave were allegedly executed afterward to ensure that no one could reveal the site. This story, though dramatic, reflects both the fear of grave robbery and the sacred reverence that his followers attached to his memory. The sudden loss of their leader left the Huns in a state of uncertainty. Attila had been the unifying force of an empire that was held together more by personal loyalty and charisma than by institutions or bureaucracy. His control over the diverse peoples within the Hunnic Confederation, Goths, Alans, Gepids, Sarmatians, and others, had depended on his ability to lead, to reward, and to intimidate. With him gone, the cohesion of the empire immediately began to fray. Attila left behind several sons, the most prominent of whom was Ellac. However, the transition of power among the Huns did not follow a fixed line of succession. Steppe leadership traditions often involved rivalry among the sons or brothers of a deceased ruler, each vying for dominance. In Attila's case, this led to internal conflict. While Ellac attempted to assert his authority, his brothers and the various tribal leaders under Hunnic dominion began to act more independently. What followed was a period of fragmentation and rebellion. The subject peoples who had once fought under Attila's banner now saw an opportunity to reclaim their autonomy. The most consequential of these was the rebellion led by the Gepids, a Germanic tribe long subject to Hunnic rule. Under their king Ardaric, the Gepids rallied other disaffected tribes and challenged the dominance of Attila's heirs. This unrest culminated in the Battle of Nedao, a major confrontation that would take place not long after Attila's death. Though that battle lies beyond the immediate scope of this section, it is enough to note here that the unity of the Hunnic Empire, so carefully maintained by Attila, could not survive without him. From the Roman perspective, the death of Attila was met with relief, though perhaps not without lingering anxiety. Both Eastern and Western courts had come to fear his name, and his ability to force concessions had undermined imperial prestige. His passing allowed Roman leaders a brief opportunity to reassert control, rebuild defenses, and recover from the devastation he had caused. Yet they also understood that his death did not immediately dissolve the threat. His sons, though divided, still commanded considerable forces, and the peoples of the steppe remained restless. Culturally, Attila's death became the stuff of legend. In Germanic heroic poetry, he was later remembered as Etzel, a powerful king who appears in the Nibelungenlied. In Christian chronicles, he was portrayed as a divine punishment for Roman sins or a scourge unleashed by God. Among the peoples of the steppe, his memory endured as that of a great conqueror, an embodiment of warrior glory, feared and respected by all. But for all the stories and symbols, the simple truth remained. The man who had shaken the Roman world to its foundations died not on a battlefield, but in his sleep, in the arms of a young bride, during a celebration of life. It was an end at odds with the drama of his reign, and yet somehow fitting for a figure whose legacy would remain as contested and mysterious as his death. The death of Attila marked the end of an era, but it did not immediately bring about the fall of the Hunnic Empire. For a brief moment, the confederation he had held together, through charisma, coercion, and calculated diplomacy, remained intact. Yet beneath the surface, the foundations of that empire were already crumbling. With no single figure capable of matching Attila's authority, internal rivalries emerged, old grievances resurfaced, and subject peoples began to resist Hunnic domination. Within only a few years, what had once been one of the most feared military powers in Europe unraveled in a series of civil conflicts and decisive defeats. Attila left behind multiple sons, among them Elak, Dengizic, and Ernak. These heirs, though all of noble blood, lacked their father's unifying presence. Steppe politics did not operate on clear hereditary succession in the Roman sense. Instead, legitimacy was often earned through strength, military success, and the loyalty of allied chiefs. Elak, believed to be the eldest and possibly Attila's designated successor, sought to assert himself as supreme ruler. However, his claim was not universally accepted. His brothers, as well as various tribal leaders within the empire, contested his authority. At the same time, the many subject peoples who had lived under Hunnic dominance, particularly the Germanic tribes such as the Gepids, Ostrogoths, Rugians, and Heruli, saw an opportunity to reclaim their independence. During Attila's lifetime, these groups had been bound to the empire through a combination of tribute arrangements, forced conscription, and political marriages. Now, with central control weakened, their resentment turned into open rebellion. The decisive confrontation came in the form of the Battle of Nedao, fought in the years shortly following Attila's death. The exact date is uncertain, but it likely occurred within 2 or 3 years of his passing. This battle was not a foreign invasion, but a civil war, a conflict between the remnants of Attila's empire and the peoples who had once served it. On one side stood Elak and the loyalist Hunnic forces. On the other stood a coalition of former subject tribes led by Ardaric, the king of the Gepids. Ardaric had been one of Attila's most trusted lieutenants. His loyalty during Attila's campaigns was well known, and he had served with distinction in both the eastern and western theaters. However, after Attila's death, Ardaric emerged as the foremost challenger to Hunnic supremacy. He now led a broad alliance of tribes who had grown weary of Hunnic demands, particularly the conscription of warriors and the heavy tribute imposed during Attila's reign. The location of the battle, believed to be somewhere in the Carpathian Basin, possibly near the river Nedao, was symbolic. It was in this region that Attila had established his power base, and it was here that the empire would fight for its survival. The two sides assembled large forces. The loyalist Huns still controlled a formidable cavalry and retained the core military strategies that had once overwhelmed Roman armies. The Gepids and their allies, however, were equally determined and now fought with the passion of peoples reclaiming their freedom. The battle itself, though sparsely documented, is described in later accounts as fierce and chaotic. The Huns employed their traditional tactics of horse archery, feigned retreats, and encircling maneuvers. But the allied tribes had learned from years of serving under Hunnic command. They understood the patterns of Hunnic warfare and had adapted their own strategies to counter them. Armed with swords, spears, and shields, the Germanic infantry held firm while their cavalry struck back with force. In the end, the battle resulted in a crushing defeat for the Huns. Elak, Attila's eldest son, was killed in combat. His death was both a symbolic and practical blow to the loyalist cause. The remaining Hunnic forces were either routed or forced to flee. The unity of the empire, already strained, now collapsed entirely. With their primary champion dead and their forces broken, the Huns could no longer maintain control over their subject territories. Following the defeat at Nedao, the Hunnic Empire disintegrated rapidly. The various tribes that had once been its foundation now asserted full independence. The Gepids, under Ardaric, established a powerful kingdom in the central Danube region. The Ostrogoths began their own migration and expansion, eventually playing a pivotal role in the post-Roman West. Other groups, such as the Rugians and Heruli, carved out smaller territories and maintained their autonomy. The surviving sons of Attila attempted to retain some measure of authority. Dengizic, in particular, led a smaller Hunnic force eastward, continuing to resist Roman influence and seeking to reassert control over parts of the steppe. He launched raids into eastern Roman territory and even attempted to negotiate with the imperial court. However, his efforts met with little success. His forces were no longer capable of large-scale campaigns, and his political influence was negligible compared to that of his father. Eventually, Dengizic himself was killed during a failed military engagement with the Eastern Romans. His head was reportedly sent to Constantinople and publicly displayed, a stark contrast to the dread once associated with the Hunnic name. With his death, the last hope for a restored Hunnic Empire vanished. Ernak, the youngest of Attila's sons, is said to have settled in the steppe regions further east, possibly maintaining a small realm among the remnants of the Hunnic people. Over time, these remnants either assimilated into other nomadic groups or faded from historical record. The collapse of the Hunnic Empire had profound consequences for Europe. It removed the single most powerful and destabilizing force on the continent and opened the way for the emergence of new kingdoms. The Roman world, though still in decline, experienced a brief period of relative stability, particularly in the east. In the west, however, the vacuum left by the Huns would soon be filled by successor states, some Romanized, others entirely barbarian. The end of the Huns also marked a turning point in the long history of Eurasian steppe powers. They had demonstrated that a nomadic confederation, under the right leadership, could challenge the might of Rome, bend empires to its will, and reshape the political landscape of an entire continent. But they had also revealed the fragility of power built on personal charisma and military dominance without lasting institutions or administrative infrastructure. In the years and centuries that followed, the memory of the Huns would echo through history. Later steppe empires, such as the Avars, Magyars, and Mongols, would follow similar paths, often invoking comparisons to the Huns. Attila himself would become a legendary figure, remembered as both a barbaric scourge and a brilliant conqueror. But in historical terms, the Huns had vanished almost as quickly as they had appeared. In the space of a few generations, they had risen from obscurity to dominate the Roman world, and then disappeared. Their empire fragmented, their legacy scattered across the lands they once ruled. With the death of Attila and the crushing defeat at the Battle of Nedao, the Hunnic Empire fell apart with remarkable speed. The vast, multi-ethnic confederation that had once threatened the very survival of both Eastern and Western Roman empires disintegrated into smaller fragments, scattered across the plains of Central and Eastern Europe. Though the Huns had shaken the known world, their exit from history was abrupt and enigmatic. Unlike other conquering peoples who left behind states, written legacies, or monuments, the Huns left almost nothing of permanence. Their disappearance raises a compelling historical question. What happened to the Huns after their fall? The first answer lies in geography. After their defeat, the remaining Hunnic forces, those that did not perish at Nedao or disperse in rebellion, retreated eastward. Their power base in the Carpathian Basin was lost, claimed by the Gepids and other formerly subordinate tribes. Some Hunnic groups attempted to settle in the lower Danube region, a territory still on the periphery of Roman influence. Others may have moved further toward the Pontic steppe, returning to the vast grasslands from which they had originally emerged. Among those who remained in the Danube frontier zone, a degree of autonomy continued for a short time. Attila's youngest son, Ernak, appears in Eastern Roman sources as a ruler of one such post-imperial group. Unlike his elder brothers, Ernak is portrayed as pragmatic and cooperative. Rather than attempt to restore Hunnic dominance through force, he chose to negotiate with Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire, relieved to see the collapse of Hunnic power, welcomed such arrangements. The Romans granted Ernak and his followers limited settlement rights in exchange for military service and loyalty. In this way, some of the Hunnic remnants became foederati, federated allies of the empire. This was not unusual in the 5th century world. The Roman state, particularly in the east, often absorbed displaced or defeated tribes into its frontier system. These groups were allowed to settle in designated regions, where they would be expected to provide troops, guard borderlands, and support imperial campaigns. Over time, they would be Romanized to varying degrees, adopting Christian practices, participating in local economies, and intermarrying with provincial populations. Outside of imperial borders, the fate of the Huns was less clear, but no less significant. The Pontic Caspian steppe remained a dynamic and often chaotic region. home to a shifting mosaic of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples. Here, the remaining Hunnic groups likely merged with other steppe populations, Sarmatians, Alans, and later Turkic-speaking tribes. In the absence of a strong central leadership or cultural infrastructure, these groups gradually lost their distinct Hunnic identity. Some historians argue that the Huns may have contributed to the formation of later nomadic confederations. The Avars, who appeared in Europe in the 6th century, are sometimes linked to the Huns in historical tradition. Byzantine sources occasionally refer to the Avars as pseudo-Avars, or Huns, suggesting either confusion or a deliberate attempt to draw on the legacy of fear associated with Attila's name. Although there is no direct lineage between the two, it is likely that remnants of the Hunnic population were absorbed into these later steppe polities. Further east, the fluidity of steppe identity meant that former Hunnic warriors, families, and cultural practices continued under new banners. Names changed, but patterns remained. The emphasis on mobility, archery, tribal leadership, and flexible political alliances remained defining features of steppe empires long after the Huns vanished from the Roman world. The cultural imprint of the Huns persisted in this way, not as a named civilization, but as part of the evolving ecology of the steppe. Another avenue through which the Huns left their mark was through legend and oral tradition. While they disappeared as a political force, their impact lived on in the stories of peoples they had once ruled, fought, or terrified. Among Germanic tribes, the Huns entered heroic literature. In the Nibelungenlied, a foundational epic of medieval German tradition, the character of Etzel is widely believed to be based on Attila. Though the poem reimagines historical events through a mythical lens, it reflects the lingering memory of Hunnic power and its impact on Central European consciousness. In the Roman world, Attila remained a symbol of apocalyptic fear. Christian chroniclers of the 6th and 7th centuries continued to write about him as a divine scourge, a punishment sent by God for the sins of the empire. His memory became intertwined with theological interpretations of decline and judgment. Yet, even as he was demonized, Attila was also remembered with a strange respect. He was, after all, the only man in recent memory to force emperors to pay tribute and to reach the gates of both Constantinople and Rome. Archaeologically, the Huns left little behind. Their nomadic lifestyle meant that they built no cities and few permanent structures. Their graves, scattered across Eastern Europe, contain weapons, horse gear, and ornaments, but rarely written inscriptions. Scholars must rely on these sparse findings, combined with hostile accounts from Roman authors, to reconstruct their world. Yet even in this absence, there is presence. The lack of a monumental legacy is itself a reminder of the radically different nature of Hunnic power, one based not on buildings or bureaucracy, but on speed, intimidation, and personal command. Some Hunnic families likely continued to exist under other names, absorbed into new communities. In regions such as Pannonia and Dacia, where the Huns had settled in large numbers, local populations may have retained aspects of their culture, passed down through generations. Linguistic traces are minimal, but certain names and traditions may reflect lingering Hunnic influence, especially in areas where intermarriage occurred with Gothic or Roman provincial elites. Meanwhile, the empire they had terrorized underwent its own transformations. The Western Roman Empire collapsed within a few decades of Attila's death. It was not the Huns who brought about the final fall of the West, but their presence had undoubtedly accelerated the decline. The Eastern Roman Empire, by contrast, survived and adapted. The lessons learned during the Hunnic invasions shaped Byzantine military and diplomatic practices for centuries to come, especially in dealing with nomadic powers on the frontier. In the broader sense, the dispersal of the Huns reflected a common pattern in nomadic imperial history. Steppe empires often rose quickly and fell just as fast. Without stable institutions or centralized administration, their cohesion depended on the personality and ability of a single leader. When that leader died, as with Attila, the empire unraveled and its parts were reabsorbed into the landscape from which they had emerged. Yet their legacy should not be underestimated. The Huns had redrawn the map of Europe, They had upended the balance of power, initiated mass migrations, and forced Rome into concessions previously unthinkable. They demonstrated the vulnerability of even the greatest empires to external, mobile threats. Their very disappearance gave rise to enduring questions about identity, resilience, and the fragile line between terror and power. With the disappearance of the Huns from the political stage, Europe entered a new phase of fragmentation and transformation. While the Hunnic threat had been terrifying in its immediacy, its collapse left behind a chaotic vacuum that brought both relief and instability. Now freed from the pressure of steppe conquest, the Roman world, particularly in the West, found itself facing different but no less dangerous challenges. What followed was not a restoration of imperial strength, but a steady unraveling of Roman control, a power struggle among emerging barbarian kingdoms, and a subtle but irreversible shift in the balance of European civilization. In the years following the death of Attila and the dissolution of his empire, the Western Roman Empire continued its descent into terminal decline. Although the immediate fear of another Hunnic invasion had passed, the damage done by decades of warfare and tribute payments could not be undone. The cities of northern Italy, still reeling from Attila's campaign, had not recovered. Agricultural production had fallen, trade networks were disrupted, and much of the local infrastructure had collapsed. Flavius Aetius, the Roman general who had stood as the last true defender of Western imperial interests, was assassinated not long after the Huns disappeared. Emperor Valentinian III, suspicious of Aetius's growing power and influenced by court intrigue, struck down his greatest general with his own hands during a court audience. But the emperor's triumph was short-lived. He himself was assassinated within a year, possibly by loyalists of Aetius or other factions enraged by the breakdown of authority. This sequence of killings triggered a spiral of instability. With the central government in disarray and its military command structure broken, various provincial leaders began to act independently. In Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa, Roman control eroded rapidly. The Visigoths, previously federates of the empire, now asserted themselves as a dominant power in southwestern Gaul. The Burgundians expanded in the Rhone Valley. In North Africa, the Vandals had already established a kingdom under Gaiseric, and their control over Carthage and the western Mediterranean was now undisputed. The absence of the Huns, once feared as the greatest threat to Roman stability, now revealed that they had also played an indirect role in maintaining the imperial order. Their presence had acted as a common enemy, one that compelled the Romans and their allies to cooperate, however reluctantly. With that pressure gone, old rivalries resurfaced. The Western Empire's remaining resources were now turned inward or consumed in petty disputes rather than in coordinated efforts to restore order. In the East, the situation was more stable. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, had survived the Hunnic invasions by employing a combination of diplomacy, tribute, and careful military responses. It had endured the humiliation of paying gold to Attila, but in the aftermath it reasserted control over the Balkans and fortified its northern defenses. Its bureaucracy remained intact, and its army, reorganized and refitted, became the backbone of a revived Eastern Roman or Byzantine state. This divergence between East and West was no accident. The East had stronger economic foundations, a more secure administrative system, and fewer internal divisions. The West, in contrast, had suffered from chronic civil wars, economic collapse, and the disintegration of central authority. When the Huns retreated, the East recovered. The West continued to decay. The culmination of this decline came in the final quarter of the 5th century. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, leader of the Heruli and a former Roman military commander, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. This symbolic act, taking place in the city of Ravenna, marked the end of the Western Roman imperial line. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that a single emperor in the East was sufficient. Though he ruled Italy as a nominal vassal of the Eastern Empire, in practice, he was independent. This final act in the Western imperial drama underscored the shift in the meaning of Rome. The city itself had long since ceased to be the capital of empire. Its symbolic power remained, but real authority now belonged to generals, warlords, and provincial rulers who carved out domains in the ruins of Roman administration. Yet, in this world, after the Huns, the echoes of their influence were still felt. The geopolitical map of Europe had been redrawn by their presence. The Visigoths had migrated into the Western Empire due to Hunnic pressure decades earlier. The Vandals had crossed into North Africa during the same period of upheaval. The Huns had indirectly driven the fragmentation of imperial territory, even if they had not administered it themselves. Their role in the larger migration period had been catalytic, not only in military terms but in demographic and political shifts as well. Furthermore, the fall of the Hunnic Empire also allowed for the emergence of new powers. The Ostrogoths, once dominated by the Huns, reasserted their independence. Under the leadership of Theodoric the Great, they migrated westward and eventually conquered Italy. Theodoric's reign would bring a brief period of revival to the former Roman heartlands, albeit under Gothic rule. The Eastern Roman Empire, too, learned important lessons from its encounters with the Huns. It refined its diplomatic practices, developed more effective frontier defenses, and cultivated strategies for managing nomadic threats. These would prove vital in later centuries when dealing with Slavic migrations, Avars, Bulgars, and eventually the early Turks. The experience with Attila shaped Byzantine attitudes towards steppe diplomacy and military preparedness for generations. In cultural memory, Rome's experience with the Huns became a touchstone for discussions about imperial vulnerability and divine punishment. Christian writers continued to view Attila's invasions as a form of retribution. They pointed to Rome's sins, its moral decay, and its loss of religious discipline as causes for divine wrath. The fall of cities, the burning of churches, and the deaths of thousands were interpreted through a spiritual lens, casting the Huns not merely as invaders, but as agents of judgment. Despite the trauma and destruction, Rome's influence endured. Latin remained a dominant language in the West. Roman law, municipal governance, and cultural traditions survived in adapted forms across the new barbarian kingdoms. Yet the unity and identity of the Roman world had changed. No longer a centralized empire, it had become a fragmented mosaic, shaped in part by the memory of its struggle with the Huns. The disappearance of the Huns did not usher in peace. Instead, it signaled a new phase of regional conflict, realignment, and cultural transformation. In many ways, the Huns had been a symptom of a larger process, the crumbling of a world order that had lasted for centuries. Their rise exposed the weaknesses of late imperial institutions, and their fall revealed that nothing would return to what had come before. Though the Hunnic Empire vanished from the political map of Europe, the memory of the Huns, especially their most infamous leader Attila, echoed far beyond their time. In many ways, the historical Huns disappeared faster than the fear and fascination they inspired. Generations after their retreat from the stage of history, they lived on in legend, chronicled in the writings of Romans, remembered in the songs of Germanic tribes, and woven into medieval myths that reshaped the truth of their deeds into symbols of both terror and admiration. To understand how the Huns were remembered, one must begin with the contemporaneous Roman and Byzantine sources. These accounts were mostly written by individuals who had never personally encountered the Huns, but who lived in cities and courts shaken by their presence. They tended to describe the Huns as an almost supernatural force, nomadic, cruel, alien, and unstoppable. Ammianus Marcellinus, one of the earliest Roman authors to describe them, emphasized their strangeness. He portrayed them as subhuman, living without fire-cooked meals, fixed dwellings, or recognizable language, and suggested that they were barely civilized at all. These descriptions were, in part, a reflection of Roman ethnocentrism. The Huns' nomadic lifestyle, lack of permanent architecture, and foreign customs were interpreted not simply as different, but as inherently inferior. Roman authors often wrote from a position of cultural superiority, casting steppe peoples as barbarians who threatened the civilized order. At the same time, this portrayal served a political purpose. It magnified the threat of the Huns, thereby justifying Roman fear and failure. When emperors paid tribute or fled in the face of invasion, the narrative of barbarian otherness helped explain and rationalize such actions. Yet even within this hostile tradition, a strange respect for Attila emerged. Priscus, a Roman diplomat who visited Attila's court, offered a more balanced and first-hand account. He described Attila as stern, disciplined, and remarkably restrained in his personal habits. Unlike his warriors, who wore expensive clothing and indulged in rich feasts, Attila dressed modestly, drank sparingly, and conducted himself with a quiet confidence. Priscus's account, though shaped by his Roman worldview, preserved a glimpse of Attila as a real and complex leader, not merely a figure of fear, but a ruler with personal charisma and control. Over time, as the memory of the actual events faded, the image of the Huns transformed in cultural imagination. In the Germanic world, they became characters in heroic sagas. Attila, now called Etzel, appeared in the Nibelungenlied, a medieval German epic composed many centuries after his death. In this story, he is portrayed not as a destroyer, but as a mighty king, noble in some aspects, entangled in the tragic destinies of the Germanic heroes. The historical Attila's fearsome qualities were softened and romanticized, his court turned into a backdrop for honor, vengeance, and sorrow. This transformation reveals how different societies adapted the Huns to their own narrative needs. To the Germanic peoples who had once feared and fought under Attila, he became part of their origin stories, a powerful outsider whose legacy was absorbed into their cultural DNA. His depiction in these tales may not have reflected historical truth, but it demonstrated the Huns' deep psychological imprint on the populations they encountered. In the Norse tradition, too, the memory of Attila surfaced. The Volsunga saga and other Old Norse texts contain characters and episodes that echo the themes of Hunnic dominance and interaction with Germanic tribes. The details are often fictionalized, but they reflect a broad pattern: the integration of Attila and the Huns into the mythological structure of early medieval northern Europe. Meanwhile, in the Christian tradition, Attila's legacy took on another form. He was commonly referred to as the Scourge of God, a phrase that appeared in both Eastern and Western ecclesiastical writings. This label did not merely condemn him as a villain, it framed his invasions as divine punishment, a chastisement sent by God upon a sinful and declining Roman world. Such an interpretation served theological and political purposes. It explained the empire's suffering not as a result of failed leadership or internal decay, but as a test of faith and morality. Church historians and theologians used the story of Attila to preach repentance. His ability to humble emperors and destroy cities was cited as a warning about pride and excess. Some even claimed that prayers and fasting had saved Rome from destruction, elevating religious figures such as Pope Leo I to near miraculous status. These narratives enhanced the authority of the Church, portraying spiritual power as stronger than military might. In the centuries that followed, the memory of the Huns continued to evolve. During the Middle Ages, European chroniclers sometimes used the term Hun as a general label for any savage or foreign invader, blurring the historical distinctions between different steppe peoples. When the Avars appeared in the 6th century, Byzantine sources occasionally referred to them as Huns. Later, when the Magyars arrived in the Carpathian Basin during the 9th century, some medieval writers claimed they were the descendants of Attila's warriors returning to reclaim their homeland. This idea that later nomadic groups were the heirs of the Huns was not based on linguistic or archaeological evidence, but on the power of inherited fear. The image of Attila had become archetypal. He stood not only for one man or one people, but for a recurring threat from the east, a symbol of invasion, fire, and the collapse of order. This archetype would persist in European consciousness long after the last Hunnic horse had galloped across the Danube. In more modern times, the name Hun took on new political meanings. During the First World War, British propaganda referred to German soldiers as Huns, invoking memories of barbarism and brutality. This usage, though far removed from historical reality, illustrates how deeply the idea of the Huns had embedded itself in European cultural language. A people long vanished still served as shorthand for destruction and the collapse of civilization. Yet for all these layers of fear and myth, historians today seek to understand the Huns not as caricatures, but as a real people shaped by their environment, their needs, and their strategies. The simplistic view of the Huns as mindless destroyers has been gradually replaced by more nuanced interpretations. Scholars recognize the complexity of their society, their skilled horse archery, their flexible military tactics, their pragmatic diplomacy, and their ability to unify diverse groups under a powerful leadership model. In the field of archaeology, discoveries in the Carpathian Basin, the Pontic Steppe, and the Danube frontier have revealed more about Hunnic burial practices, trade relations, and material culture. These findings paint a picture of a people who were not only warriors but also part of the broader economic and cultural networks of late antiquity. The challenge of writing Hunnic history lies in the absence of their own voice. They left no written records. Everything we know about them comes from others, usually enemies. This makes the task of reconstruction difficult but not impossible. Through cross-examination of texts, archaeological evidence, and comparative study with other nomadic cultures, historians continue to bring the Huns out from the shadow of legend and into the light of critical understanding. The story of the Huns is not merely the story of a vanished empire. It is part of a much larger pattern, a recurring dynamic between steppe and sedentary civilizations that has shaped human history across centuries. From their obscure origins on the Central Asian grasslands to their sudden and decisive presence on the edges of the Roman world, the Huns exemplified the potential of nomadic societies to transform the political order of the more established, urbanized world around them. The rise of the Huns disrupted the stability of late antiquity. Their mobility, adaptability, and capacity for both war and diplomacy placed them in a category unlike anything the Roman world had encountered before. They did not seek to build cities or mimic imperial institutions. Instead, they mastered the art of extraction, demanding tribute, commanding fear, and shaping geopolitics through speed and strategic violence. And yet, their power was also their limitation. The same decentralization that gave them flexibility made them vulnerable to fragmentation. The empire they built lasted not through institutions, but through the authority of one man. When Attila died, that authority could not be replaced. The Huns had no enduring infrastructure to bind their vast confederation. Without a strong hand at the center, their cohesion dissolved. What followed was not silence, but absorption. The peoples they had ruled, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Alans, and others, reasserted themselves. Some moved into the spaces Rome had abandoned. Others fought each other. Some even adapted parts of the Hunnic military model, which itself had drawn from earlier nomadic cultures of the steppe. In this way, the Huns left behind more than ruins. They left behind tactics, strategies, and patterns of rule that would influence future empires. Indeed, the Huns were part of a broader continuum of nomadic power stretching across Eurasia. Before them, the Xiongnu had challenged China. After them, the Avars, Magyars, and later the Mongols would follow a similar path, moving westward, forming powerful coalitions, threatening or toppling sedentary states, and eventually integrating into the political landscape they once seemed poised to destroy. This continuity highlights a central historical reality. The steppe was not a void beyond the frontiers of civilization. It was a distinct geopolitical space with its own logic. Nomadic societies like the Huns had their own traditions of leadership, their own forms of legitimacy, and their own methods of organizing power. They were not failed empires. They were empires of a different kind. So what changed? In the wake of the Huns, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. But this collapse was not solely the work of Attila and his horsemen. It was the culmination of centuries of internal decline, economic stress, and structural fragility. What the Huns did was accelerate that process. They exposed the vulnerabilities of a system already under pressure. They forced Rome to confront its limits, military, financial, and ideological. In the east, however, the Roman world endured. The Byzantine Empire adapted, restructured, and survived. It learned to deal with nomadic powers through diplomacy, intelligence, and pragmatic treaties. The Eastern Romans recognized that not every threat could be met with force. They developed a sophisticated toolkit for navigating the frontier world, an approach that would serve them well for centuries. What still resonates today is the nature of disruption. The Huns were, above all, a force of disruption. They did not overthrow Rome with a single battle or by capturing the capital. They reshaped the world through persistent pressure, strategic unpredictability, and the harnessing of mobility. Their legacy reminds us that power does not always come from established institutions or large populations. Sometimes it comes from the ability to move, to adapt, and to strike when others cannot. Modern states no longer face steppe invasions, but the deeper pattern endures. Disruptive forces, whether technological, economic, or political, continue to challenge large, complex systems. History teaches us that stability is rarely permanent. It must be maintained through foresight, flexibility, and the capacity to respond to forces that originate beyond the usual centers of power. The Huns, in their brief ascendancy, demonstrated what can happen when a world assumes its order is secure, and it is not. Their story is not just about the fall of cities or the death of an empire. It is about the sudden arrival of a new kind of power and how the world must change in response. In the end, the Huns disappeared, absorbed into the history they had so violently altered. But their impact remained, woven into the evolution of Europe, remembered in legend, and echoed in the rise of later nomadic powers. They were, for a time, the storm on the steppe, the ones who came, who saw, and who forced a world to change. And though their names may fade, the questions they raised about power, resilience, and response remain as relevant now as they were on the day Attila crossed the Danube.